No Bird Sings by E.F.Benson and read by Christopher Horton. The red chimneys of the house for which I was bound were visible from just outside the station at which I had alighted, and so the chauffeur told me the distance was not more than a mile's walk if I took the path across the fields. It ran straight till it came to the edge of that wood yonder, which belonged to my host, and above which his chimneys were visible. I should find a gate in the paling of this wood, and a track traversing it which debouched close to his garden. So in this adorable afternoon of early May, it seemed a waste of time to do other than walk through meadows and woods, and I set off on foot, while the motor carried my traps. It was one of those golden days which every now and again leak out of paradise and drip to earth. Spring had been late in coming, but now it was here with a burst, and the whole world was boiling with the sap of life. Never have I seen such a wealth of spring flowers, or such vividness of green, or heard such melodious business among the birds in the hedgerows. This walk through the meadows was a jubilee of festal ecstasy. And best of all, so I promised myself, would be the passage through the wood, newly fledged with milky green, that lay just ahead. There was the gate just facing me, and I passed through it into the dappled lights and shadows of the grass-grown track. Coming out of the brilliant sunshine was like entering a dim tunnel. One had the sense of being suddenly withdrawn from the brightness of the spring into some subaqueous cavern. The treetops formed a green roof overhead, excluding the light to a remarkable degree. I moved in a world of shifting obscurity. Presently, as the trees grew more scattered, their place was taken by a thick growth of hazels which met over the path, and then, the ground sloping downwards, I came upon an open clearing, covered with bracken and heather, and studded with birches. But though now I walked once more beneath the luminous sky with the sunlight pouring down, it seemed to have lost its effulgence. The brightness, was it some odd optical illusion? Was veiled as if it came through crape. Yet there was the sun still well above the treetops in an unclouded heaven. But for all that, the light was that of a stormy winter's day, without warmth or brilliance. It was oddly silent, too. I had thought that the bushes and trees would be ringing with the song of mating birds, but listening, I could hear no note of any sort, neither the fluting of thrush or blackbird, nor the cheerful whir of the chaffinch, nor the cooing wood-pigeon, nor the strident clamour of the jay. I paused to verify this odd silence. There was no doubt about it. It was rather eerie, rather uncanny, but I suppose the birds knew their own business best, and if they were too busy to sing, it was their affair. As I went on, it struck me also that since entering the wood, I had not seen a bird of any kind, and now, as I crossed the clearing, I kept my eyes alert for them, but fruitlessly, and soon I entered the further belt of thick trees which surrounded it. Most of them, I noticed, were beeches, growing very close to each other, and the ground beneath them was bare but for the carpet of fallen leaves, and a few thin bramble bushes. In this curious dimness and thickness of the trees, it was impossible to see far to right or left of the path, and now, for the first time since I had left the open, I heard some sound of life. There came the rustle of leaves from not far away, and I thought to myself that a rabbit anyhow was moving, but somehow it lacked the staccato patter of a small animal. There was a certain stealthy heaviness about it, as if something much larger were stealing along and desirous of not being heard. I paused again to see what might emerge, but instantly the sound ceased. Simultaneously I was conscious of some faint but very foul odour reaching me, a smell choking and corrupt, yet somehow pungent, more like the odour of something alive rather than rotting. It was peculiarly sickening, and not wanting to get any closer to its source, I went on my way. Before long I came to the edge of the wood. Straight in front of me was a strip of meadowland, and beyond an iron gate between two brick walls, through which I had a glimpse of lawn and flower beds. To the left stood the house, and over house and garden there poured the amazing brightness of the declining afternoon. Hugh Granger and his wife were sitting out on the lawn with the usual pack of assorted dogs, a Welsh collie, a yellow retriever, a fox terrier, and a Pekingese. Their protest at my intrusion gave way to the welcome of recognition, and I was admitted into the circle. There was much to say, for I had been out of England for the last 3 months, during which time Hugh had settled into this little estate, left him by a recluse uncle, and he and Daisy had been busy during the Easter vacation with getting into the house. Certainly it was a most attractive legacy. The house through which I was presently taken was a delightful little Queen Anne manor, and its situation on the edge of this heather-clad Surrey ridge quite superb. We had tea in a small panelled parlour overlooking the garden, and soon the wider topics narrowed down to those of the day and the hour. I had walked, had I? Asked Daisy from the station. Did I go through the wood or follow the path outside it? The question she thus put to me was given trivially enough. There was no hint in her voice that it mattered a straw to her which way I had come. But it was quite clearly borne in upon me that not only she but Hugh also listened intently for my reply. He had just lit a match for his cigarette, but held it unapplied till he heard my answer. Yes, I had gone through the wood, but now, though I had received some odd impressions in the wood, it seemed quite ridiculous to mention what they were. I could not soberly say that the sunshine there was of the very poor quality, and that at one point in my traverse I had smelt a most iniquitous odour. I had walked through the wood, that was all I had to tell them. I had known both my host and hostess for a tale of many years, and now when I felt that there was nothing except purely fanciful stuff that I could volunteer about my experiences there, I noticed that they exchanged a swift glance and could easily interpret it. Each of them signalled to the other an expression of relief. They told each other, so I construed their glance, that I at any rate had found nothing unusual in the wood, and they were pleased at that. But then, before any real pause had succeeded to my answer that I had gone through the wood, I remembered that strange absence of birdsong and birds, and as that seemed an innocuous observation in natural history, I thought I might as well mention it. One odd thing struck me, I began, and instantly I saw the attention of both riveted again. I didn't see a single bird or hear one from the time I entered the wood to when I left it. Hugh lit his cigarette. "I've noticed that too," he said, "and it's rather puzzling. The wood is certainly a bit of primeval forest, and one would have thought that hosts of birds would have nested in it from time immemorial. But like you, I've never heard or seen one in it, and I've never seen a rabbit there either." "I thought I heard one this afternoon," said I. "Something was moving in the fallen beech leaves." "Did you see it?" he asked. I recollected that I had decided that the noise was not quite the patter of a rabbit. "No, I didn't see it," I said, "and perhaps it wasn't one. It sounded, I remember, more like something larger." Once again, and unmistakably, a glance passed between Hugh and his wife, and she rose. "I must be off," she said. "Post goes out at 7, and I lazed all morning. What are you two going to do?" "Something out of doors, please," said I. "I want to see the domain." Hugh and I accordingly strolled out again with the cohort of dogs. The domain was certainly very charming. A small lake lay beyond the garden, with a reed bed vocal with warblers, and a tufted margin into which coots and moorhens scudded at our approach. Rising from the end of that was a high heathery knoll full of rabbit holes, which the dogs nosed at with joyful expectations, and there we sat for a while, overlooking the wood, which covered the rest of the estate. Even now, in the blaze of the sun, near to its setting, it seemed to be in shadow, though like the rest of the view it should have basked in brilliance, for not a cloud flecked the sky, and the level rays enveloped the world in a crimson splendour. But the wood was grey and darkling. Hugh also, I was aware, had been looking at it, and now, with an air of breaking into a disagreeable topic, he turned to me. "Tell me," he said, "does anything strike you about that wood?" "Yes, it seems to lie in shadow." He frowned. "But it can't, you know," he said. "Where does the shadow come from? Not from outside, for sky and land are on fire." From inside, then? I asked. He was silent a moment. There's something queer about it, he said at length. There's something there, and I don't know what it is. Daisy feels it too. She won't ever go into the wood, and it appears that birds won't either. Is it just the fact that for some unexplained reason there are no birds in it that has set all our imaginations at work? I jumped up. Oh, it's all rubbish, I said. Let's go through it now and find a bird. I bet you I find a bird. 6pence for every bird you see, said Hugh. We went down the hillside and walked round the wood till we came to the gate where I had entered that afternoon. I held it open after I had gone in for the dogs to follow, but there they stood, a yard or so away, and none of them moved. Come on, dogs, I said, and Fifi, the fox terrier, came a step nearer, and then with a little whine retreated again. They always do that, said Hugh. Not one of them will set foot inside the wood. Look! He whistled and called, he cajoled and scolded, but it was no use. There the dogs remained, with little apologetic grins and signallings of tails, but quite determined not to come. But why? I asked. Same reason as the birds, I suppose, whatever that happens to be. There's Fifi, for instance, the sweetest-tempered little lady. Once I tried to pick her up and carry her in, and she snapped at me. They'll have nothing to do with the wood. They'll trot round outside it and go home. We left them there, and in the sunset light, which was now beginning to fade, began the passage. Usually the sense of eeriness disappears if one has a companion, but now, to me, even with Hugh walking by my side, the place seemed even more uncanny than it had done that afternoon, and a sense of intolerable uneasiness that grew into a sort of waking nightmare obsessed me. I had thought before that the silence and loneliness of it had played tricks with my nerves, but with Hugh here it could not be that, and indeed I felt that it was not any such notion that lay at the root of this fear, but rather the conviction that there was some presence lurking there, invisible as yet, but permeating the gathered gloom. I could not form the slightest idea of what it might be, or whether it was material or ghostly. All I could diagnose of it from my own sensations was that it was evil and antique. As we came to the open ground in the middle of the wood, Hugh stopped, and though the evening was cool, I noticed that he mopped his forehead. Pretty nasty, he said. No wonder the dogs don't like it. How do you feel about it? Before I could answer, he shot out his hand, pointing to the belt of trees that lay beyond. What's that? He said in a whisper. I followed his finger, and for 1/2 second thought I saw, against the black of the wood, some vague flicker, grey or faintly luminous. It waved as if it had been the head and forepart of some huge snake rearing itself, but it instantly disappeared, and my glimpse had been so momentary that I could not trust my impression. It's gone, said Hugh, still looking in the direction he had pointed, and as we stood there, I heard again what I had heard that afternoon, a rustle among the fallen beech leaves, but there was no wind nor breath of breeze astir. He turned to me. What on earth was it? He said. It looked like some enormous slug standing up. Did you see it? I'm not sure whether I did or not, I said. I think I just caught sight of what you saw. But what was it? He said again. Was it a real material creature, or was it... Something ghostly, do you mean? I asked. Something halfway between the two, he said. I'll tell you what I mean afterwards, when we've got out of this place. The thing, whatever it was, had vanished among the trees to the left of where our path lay, and in silence we walked across the open till we came to where it entered tunnel-like among the trees. Frankly, I hated and feared the thought of plunging into that darkness, with the knowledge that not so far off there was something the nature of which I could not ever so faintly conjecture, but which I now made no doubt was that which filled the wood with some nameless terror. Was it material? Was it ghostly? Or was it, and now some inkling of what Hugh meant began to form itself into my mind, some being that lay on the borderland between the two? Of all the sinister possibilities, that appeared the most terrifying. As we entered the trees again, I perceived that reek, alive and yet corrupt, which I had smelt before, but now it was far more potent, and we hurried on, choking with the odour that I now guessed to be not the putrescence of decay, but the living substance of that which crawled and reared itself in the darkness of the wood, where no bird would shelter. Somewhere among those trees lurked the reptilian thing that defied and yet compelled credence. It was a blessed relief to get out of that dim tunnel into the wholesome air of the open and the clear light of evening. Within doors, when we returned, windows were curtained and lamps lit. There was a hint of frost, and Hugh put a match to the fire in his room, where the dog, still a little apologetic, hailed us with thumpings of drowsy tails. "And now we've got to talk," said he, "and lay our plans, for whatever it is that is in the wood, we've got to make an end of it. And if you want to know what I think it is, I'll tell you." "Go ahead," said I. "You may laugh at me if you like," he said, "but I believe it's an elemental. That's what I meant when I said it was a being halfway between the material and the ghostly. I never caught a glimpse of it till this afternoon. I only felt there was something horrible there. But now I've seen it, and it's like what spiritualists and that sort of folk describe as an elemental. A huge phosphorescent slug is what they tell us of it, which at will can surround itself with darkness. Somehow, now safe within doors in the cheerful light and warmth of the room, the suggestion appeared merely grotesque. Out there in the darkness of that uncomfortable wood, something within me had quaked, and I was prepared to believe any horror. But now common sense revolted. "But you don't mean to tell me you believe in such rubbish," I said. "You might as well say it was a unicorn. What is an elemental anyway? Who has ever seen one except the people who listen to raps in the darkness and say they are made by their aunts?" "What is it then?" he asked. "I should think it is chiefly our own nerves," I said. "I frankly acknowledge I got the creeps when I went through the wood first, and I got them much worse when I went through it with you. But it was just nerves. We are frightening ourselves and each other." "And are the dogs frightening themselves and each other?" he asked. "And the birds?" That was rather harder to answer. In fact, I gave it up. Hugh continued. "Well, just for the moment we'll suppose that something else, not ourselves, frightened us and the dogs and the birds," he said, "and that we did see something like a huge phosphorescent slug. I won't call it an elemental if you object to that. I'll call it it. There's another thing too, which the existence of it would explain." "What's that?" I asked. "Well, it is supposed to be some incarnation of evil. It is a corporeal form of the devil. It is not only spiritual, it is material to this extent that it can be seen bodily in form, and heard, and, as you noticed, smelt, and, God forbid, handled. It has to be kept alive by nourishment, and that explains perhaps why every day since I have been here, I've found on that knoll we went up some half-dozen dead rabbits." "Stoats and weasels," said I. "No, not stoats and weasels. Stoats kill their prey and eat it. These rabbits have not been eaten, they've been drunk." "What on earth do you mean?" I asked. "I examined several of them. There was just a small hole in their throats, and they were drained of blood. Just skin and bones and a sort of grey mash of fibre, like the fibre of an orange, which has been sucked. Also, there was a horrible smell lingering on them." "And was the thing you had a glimpse of like a stoat or a weasel?" There came a rattle at the handle of the door. "Not a word to Daisy," said Hugh as she entered. "I heard you come in," she said. "Where did you go?" "All round the place," said I, "and came back through the wood. It is odd, not a bird did we see, but that is partly accounted for because it was dark." I saw her eyes search Hugh's, but she found no communication there. I guessed that he was planning some attack on it next day, and he did not wish her to know that anything was afoot. "The wood's unpopular," he said. "Birds won't go there, dogs won't go there, and Daisy won't go there. I'm bound to say I share the feeling too, but having braved its terrors in the dark, I've broken the spell." "All quiet, was it?" asked she. Quiet wasn't the word for it. The smallest pin could have been heard dropping half a mile off. We talked over our plans that night after she had gone up to bed. Hugh's story about the sucked rabbits was rather horrible, and though there was no certain connection between those empty rinds of animals and what we had seen, There seemed a certain reasonableness about it, but anything, as he pointed out, which could feed like that was clearly not without its material side. Ghosts did not have dinner, and if it was material, it was vulnerable. Our plans, therefore, were very simple. We were going to tramp through the wood, as one walks up partridges in a field of turnips, each with a shotgun and a supply of cartridges. I cannot say that I looked forward to the expedition, for I hated the thought of getting into closer quarters with that mysterious denizen of the woods. But there was a certain excitement about it, sufficient to keep me awake a long time, and when I got to sleep to cause very vivid and awful dreams. The morning failed to fulfill the promise of the clear sunset. The sky was lowering and cloudy, and a fine rain was falling. Daisy had shopping errands, which took her into the little town, and as soon as she had set off, we started on our business. The yellow retriever, mad with joy at the sight of guns, came bounding with us across the garden, but on our entering the wood, he slunk back home again. The wood was roughly circular in shape, with a diameter perhaps of 1/2 mile. In the centre, as I have said, there was an open clearing about 1/4 mile across, which was thus surrounded by a belt of thick trees and copse, a couple of 100 yards in breadth. Our plan was first to walk together up the path which led through the wood, with all possible stealth, hoping to hear some movement on the part of what we had come to seek. Failing that, we had settled to tramp through the wood at the distance of some 50 yards from each other in a circular track. 2 or 3 of these circuits would cover the whole ground pretty thoroughly. Of the nature of our quarry, whether it would try to steal away from us or possibly attack, we had no idea. It seemed, however, yesterday to have avoided us. Rain had been falling steadily for an hour when we entered the wood. It hissed a little in the treetops overhead, but so thick was the cover that the ground below was still not more than damp. It was a dark morning outside. Here you would say that the sun had already set and that night was falling. Very quietly we moved up the grassy path, where our footfalls were noiseless, and once we caught a whiff of that odour of live corruption. But though we stayed and listened, not a sound of anything stirred except the sibilant rain over our heads. We went across the clearing and through to the far gate, and still there was no sign. "We'll be getting into the trees then," said Hugh. "We had better start where we got that whiff of it." We went back to the place, which was towards the middle of the encompassing trees. The odour still lingered on the windless air. "Go on about 50 yards, he said, "and then we'll go in. If either of us comes on the track of it, we'll shout to each other." I walked on down the path till I had gone the right distance, signalled to him, and we stepped in among the trees. I have never known the sensation of such utter loneliness. I knew that Hugh was walking parallel with me, only 50 yards away, and if I hung on my step I could faintly hear his tread among the beech leaves. But I felt as if I was quite sundered in this dim place from all companionship of man. The only live thing that lurked here was that monstrous, mysterious creature of evil. So thick were the trees that I could not see more than a dozen yards in any direction. All places outside the wood seemed infinitely remote, and infinitely remote also everything that had occurred to me in normal human life. I had been whisked out of all wholesome experiences into this antique and evil place. The rain had ceased, it whispered no longer in the treetops, testifying that there did exist a world and a sky outside, and only a few drops from above pattered on the beech leaves. Suddenly I heard the report of Hugh's gun, followed by his shouting voice. "I've missed it," he shouted. "It's coming in your direction." I heard him running towards me, the beech leaves rustling, and no doubt his footsteps drowned a stealthier noise that was close to me. All that happened now, until once more I heard the report of Hugh's gun, happened, I suppose, in less than a minute. If it had taken much longer, I do not imagine I should be telling it today. I stood there then, having heard Hugh's shout, with my gun cocked, and ready to put to my shoulder, and I listened to his running footsteps, but still I saw nothing to shoot at and heard nothing. Then, between two beech trees quite close to me, I saw what I can only describe as a ball of darkness. It rolled very swiftly towards me over the few yards that separated me from it, and then, too late, I heard the dead beech leaves rustling below it. Just before it reached me, my brain realized what it was, or what it might be, but before I could raise my gun to shoot at that nothingness, it was upon me. My gun was twitched out of my hand, and I was enveloped in this blackness, which was the very essence of corruption. It knocked me off my feet, and I sprawled flat on my back, and upon me as I lay there, I felt the weight of this invisible assailant. I groped wildly with my hands, and they clutched something cold and slimy and hairy. They slipped off it, and next moment there was laid across my shoulder and neck something which felt like an india rubber tube. The end of it fastened onto my neck like a snake, and I felt the skin rise beneath it. Again, with clutching hands, I tried to tear that obscene strength away from me, and as I struggled with it, I heard Hugh's footsteps close to me through this layer of darkness that hid everything. My mouth was free, and I shouted at him. "Here, here," I yelled, "close to you where it is darkest." I felt his hands on mine, and that added strength detached from my neck, that sucker that pulled at it. The coil that lay heavy on my legs and chest writhed and struggled and relaxed. Whatever it was that our four hands held slipped out of them, and I saw Hugh standing close to me. A yard or two off, vanishing among the beech trunks, was that blackness which had poured over me. Hugh put up his gun, and with his second barrel fired at it. The blackness dispersed, and there, wriggling and twisting like a huge worm, lay what we had come to find. It was alive still, and I picked up my gun, which lay by my side, and fired 2 more barrels into it. The writhings dwindled into mere shudderings and shakings, and then it lay still. With Hugh's help I got to my feet, and we both reloaded before going nearer. On the ground there lay a monstrous thing, half slug, half worm. There was no head to it. It ended in a blunt point with an orifice. In colour it was grey, covered with sparse black hairs. Its length, I suppose, was some 4 feet. Its thickness at the broadest part was that of a man's thigh, tapering towards each end. It was shattered by shot at its middle. There were stray pellets which had hit it elsewhere, and from the holes they had made there oozed not blood, but some grey viscous matter. As we stood there, some swift process of disintegration and decay began. It lost outline, it melted, it liquefied, and in a minute more we were looking at a mass of stained and coagulated beech leaves. Again and quickly that liquor of corruption faded, and there lay at our feet no trace of what had been there. The overpowering odour passed away, and there came from the ground just the sweet savour of wet earth in springtime, and from above the glint of a sunbeam piercing the clouds. Then a sudden pattering among the dead leaves sent my heart into my mouth again, and I cocked my gun. But it was only Hugh's yellow retriever who had joined us. We looked at each other. "You're not hurt?" he said. I held my chin up. "Not a bit," I said. "The skin's not broken, is it?" "No, only a round red mark. My God, what was it? What happened?" "Your turn first," said I. "Begin at the beginning." "I came upon it quite suddenly," he said. "It was lying coiled like a sleeping dog behind a big beech. Before I could fire, it slithered off in the direction where I knew you were. I got a snapshot at it among the trees, but I must have missed, for I heard it rustling away. I shouted to you and ran after it. There was a circle of absolute darkness on the ground, and your voice came from the middle of it. I couldn't see you at all, but I clutched at the blackness, and my hands met yours. They met something else too." We got back to the house and had put the guns away before Daisy came home from her shopping. We had also scrubbed and brushed and washed. She came into the smoking room. "You lazy folk," she said, "it has cleared up, and why are you still indoors? Let's go out at once." I got up. "Hugh has told me you've got a dislike of the wood," I said. "And it's a lovely wood. Come and see. He and I will walk on each side of you and hold your hands. The dogs shall protect you as well." "But not one of them will go a yard into the wood," said she. "Oh yes, they will. At least we'll try them. You must promise to come if they do." Hugh whistled them up, and down we went to the gate. They sat panting for it to be opened and scuttled into the thickets in pursuit of interesting smells. "And who says there are no birds in it?" said Daisy. "Look at that robin. Why, there are 2 of them. Evidently house hunting." The end. Caterpillars by E.F.Benson and read by Christopher Holton. I saw a month or 2 ago in an Italian paper that the Villa Cascana in which I once stayed had been pulled down, and that a manufactory of some sort was in process of erection on its site. There is therefore no longer any reason for refraining from writing of those things which I myself saw, or imagined I saw, in a certain room and on a certain landing of the villa in question, nor from mentioning the circumstances which followed, which may or may not, according to the opinion of the reader, throw some light on or be somehow connected with this experience. The Villa Cascana was in all ways but one a perfectly delightful house, yet if it were standing now, nothing in the world, I use the phrase in its literal sense, would induce me to set foot in it again, for I believe it to have been haunted in a very terrible and practical manner. Most ghosts, when all is said and done, do not do much harm. They may perhaps terrify, but the person whom they visit usually gets over their visitation. They may, on the other hand, be entirely friendly and beneficent. But the appearances in the Villa Cascana were not beneficent, and had they made their visit in a very slightly different manner, I do not suppose I should have got over it any more than Arthur Inglis did. The house stood on an ilex-clad hill not far from Sestri di Levante on the Italian Riviera, looking out over the iridescent blues of that enchanted sea, while behind it rose the pale green chestnut woods that climb up the hillsides till they give place to the pines that, black in contrast with them, crown the slopes. All round it the garden in the luxuriance of mid-spring bloomed and was fragrant, and the scent of magnolia and rose, borne on the salt freshness of the winds from the sea, flowed like a stream through the cool vaulted rooms. On the ground floor, a broad pillared loggia ran round 3 sides of the house, the top of which formed a balcony for certain rooms of the first floor. The main staircase, broad and of grey marble steps, led up from the hall to the landing outside these rooms, which were 3 in number, namely 2 big sitting rooms and a bedroom arranged en suite. The latter was unoccupied, the sitting rooms were in use. From these, the main staircase was continued to the second floor, where were situated certain bedrooms, one of which I occupied, while from the other side of the first floor landing, some 6 steps led to another suite of rooms, where at the time I am speaking of, Arthur Inglis, the artist, had his bedroom and studio. Thus, the landing outside my bedroom at the top of the house commanded both the landing of the first floor and also the steps that led to Inglis's rooms. Jim Stanley and his wife, finally, whose guest I was, occupied rooms in another wing of the house, where also were the servants' quarters. I arrived just in time for lunch on a brilliant noon of mid-May. The garden was shouting with colour and fragrance, and not less delightful after my broiling walk up from the marina should have been the coming from the reverberating heat and blaze of the day into the marble coolness of the villa. Only, the reader has my bare word for this, and nothing more. The moment I set foot in the house, I felt that something was wrong. This feeling, I may say, was quite vague, though very strong, and I remember that when I saw letters waiting for me on the table in the hall, I felt certain that the explanation was here. I was convinced that there was bad news of some sort for me. Yet when I opened them, I found no such explanation of my premonition. My correspondence all reeked of prosperity. Yet this clear miscarriage of a presentiment did not dissipate my uneasiness. In that cool, fragrant house there was something wrong. I am at pains to mention this because to the general view it may explain that though I am as a rule so excellent a sleeper that the extinction of my light on getting into bed is apparently contemporaneous with being called on the following morning, I slept very badly on my first night in the Villa Cascana. It may also explain the fact that when I did sleep, if it was indeed in sleep that I saw what I thought I saw, I dreamed in a very vivid and original manner. Original, that is to say, in the sense that something that, as far as I knew, had never previously entered into my consciousness, usurped it then. But since, in addition to this evil premonition, certain words and events occurring during the rest of the day might have suggested something of what I thought happened that night, it will be well to relate them. After lunch then, I went round the house with Mrs. Stanley, and during our tour she referred, it is true, to the unoccupied bedroom on the first floor, which opened out of the room where we had lunched. "We left that unoccupied," she said, "because Jim and I have a charming bedroom and dressing room, as you saw, in the wing, and if we used it ourselves, we should have to turn the dining room into a dressing room and have our meals downstairs. As it is, however, we have our little flat there. Arthur Inglis has his little flat in the other passage, and I remembered, aren't I extraordinary, that you once said that the higher up you were in a house, the better you were pleased. So I put you at the top of the house, instead of giving you that room." It is true that a doubt vague as my uneasy premonition crossed my mind at this. I did not see why Mrs. Stanley should have explained all this, if there had not been more to explain. I allow, therefore, that the thought that there was something to explain about the unoccupied bedroom was momentarily present to my mind. The second thing that may have borne on my dream was this. At dinner the conversation turned for a moment on ghosts. Inglis, with the certainty of conviction, expressed his belief that anybody who could possibly believe in the existence of supernatural phenomena was unworthy of the name of an ass. The subject instantly dropped. As far as I can recollect, nothing else occurred or was said that could bear on what follows. We all went to bed rather early, and personally I yawned my way upstairs, feeling hideously sleepy. My room was rather hot, and I threw all the windows wide, and from without poured in the white light of the moon, and the love song of many nightingales. I undressed quickly and got into bed, but though I had felt so sleepy before, I now felt extremely wide awake. But I was quite content to be awake. I did not toss or turn. I felt perfectly happy listening to the song and seeing the light. Then it is possible I may have gone to sleep, and what follows may have been a dream. I thought anyhow that after a time the nightingales ceased singing and the moon sank. I thought also that if for some unexplained reason I was going to lie awake all night, I might as well read, and I remembered that I had left a book in which I was interested in the dining room on the first floor. So I got out of bed, lit a candle and went downstairs. I went into the room, saw on a side table the book I had come to look for, and then, simultaneously, saw that the door into the unoccupied bedroom was open. A curious grey light, not of dawn nor of moonshine, came out of it, and I looked in. The bed stood just opposite the door, a big four-poster, hung with tapestry at the head. Then I saw that the greyish light of the bedroom came from the bed, or rather from what was on the bed, for it was covered with great caterpillars, a foot or more in length, which crawled over it. They were faintly luminous, and it was the light from them that showed me the room. Instead of the sucker feet of ordinary caterpillars, they had rows of pincers like crabs, and they moved by grasping what they lay on with their pincers, and then sliding their bodies forward. In colour, these dreadful insects were yellowish-grey, and they were covered with irregular lumps and swellings. There must have been hundreds of them, for they formed a sort of writhing, crawling pyramid on the bed. Occasionally one fell off onto the floor, with a soft fleshy thud, and though the floor was of hard concrete, it yielded to the pincer feet as if it had been putty, and crawling back, the caterpillar would mount onto the bed again to rejoin its fearful companions. They appeared to have no faces, so to speak, but at one end of them there was a mouth that opened sideways in respiration. Then, as I looked, it seemed to me as if they all suddenly became conscious of my presence. All the mouths at any rate were turned in my direction, and next moment they began dropping off the bed with those soft, fleshy thuds onto the floor, and wriggling towards me. For 1 second, a paralysis as of a dream was on me, but the next I was running upstairs again to my room, and I remember feeling the cold of the marble steps on my bare feet. I rushed into my bedroom and slammed the door behind me, and then, I was certainly wide awake now, I found myself standing by my bed with the sweat of terror pouring from me. The noise of the banged door still rang in my ears, but as would have been more usual if this had been mere nightmare, the terror that had been mine when I saw those foul beasts crawling about the bed or dropping softly onto the floor did not cease then. Awake now, if dreaming before, I did not at all recover from the horror of dream. It did not seem to me that I had dreamed, and until dawn I sat or stood, not daring to lie down, thinking that every rustle or movement that I heard was the approach of the caterpillars. To them and the claws that bit into the cement, the wood of the door was child's play. Steel would not keep them out. But with the sweet and noble return of day, the horror vanished. The whisper of wind became benignant again. The nameless fear, whatever it was smoothed out and terrified me no longer. Dawn broke, hueless at first, then it grew dove-coloured, then the flaming pageant of light spread over the sky. The admirable rule of the house was that everybody had breakfast where and when he pleased, and in consequence, it was not till lunchtime that I met any of the other members of our party, since I had breakfast on my balcony and wrote letters and other things till lunch. In fact, I got down to that meal rather late, after the other three had begun. Between my knife and fork there was a small pillbox of cardboard, and as I sat down, Inglis spoke. "Do look at that," he said, "since you are interested in natural history. I found it crawling on my counterpane last night, and I don't know what it is." I think that before I opened the pillbox I expected something of the sort which I found in it. Inside it anyhow was a small caterpillar, greyish-yellow in colour, with curious bumps and excrescences on its rings. It was extremely active, and hurried round the box this way and that. Its feet were unlike the feet of any caterpillar I ever saw. They were like the pincers of a crab. I looked and shut the lid down again. "No, I don't know it," I said, "but it looks rather unwholesome. What are you going to do with it?" "Oh, I shall keep it," said Inglis. "It has begun to spin. I want to see what sort of a moth it turns into." I opened the box again and saw that these hurrying movements were indeed the beginning of the spinning of the web of its cocoon. Then Inglis spoke again. "It has got funny feet too," he said. "They are like crab's pincers. What's the Latin for crab?" "Oh yes, Cancer. So in case it is unique, let's christen it Cancer inglisensis." Then something happened in my brain, some momentary piecing together of all that I had seen or dreamed. Something in his words seemed to me to throw light on it all, and my own intense horror at the experience of the night before linked itself on to what he had just said. In effect, I took the box and threw it, caterpillar and all, out of the window. There was a gravel path just outside, and beyond it a fountain playing into a basin. The box fell onto the middle of this. Inglis laughed. "So the students of the occult don't like solid facts," he said. "My poor caterpillar." The talk went off again at once onto other subjects, and I have only given in detail as they happened these trivialities in order to be sure myself that I have recorded everything that could have borne on occult subjects or on the subject of caterpillars. But at the moment when I threw the pillbox into the fountain, I lost my head. My only excuse is that, as is probably plain, the tenant of it was, in miniature, exactly what I had seen crowded onto the bed in the unoccupied room, and though this translation of those phantoms into flesh and blood, or whatever it is that caterpillars are made of, ought perhaps to have relieved the horror of the night, as a matter of fact it did nothing of the kind. It only made the crawling pyramid that covered the bed in the unoccupied room more hideously real. After lunch we spent a lazy hour or two strolling about the garden or sitting in the loggia, and it must have been about 4 o'clock when Stanley and I started off to bathe, down the path that led by the fountain into which I had thrown the pillbox. The water was shallow and clear, and at the bottom of it I saw its white remains. The water had disintegrated the cardboard, and it had become no more than a few strips and shreds of sodden paper. The centre of the fountain was a marble Italian Cupid, which squirted the water out of a wineskin held under its arm, and crawling up its leg was the caterpillar. Strange and scarcely credible as it seemed, it must have survived the falling to bits of its prison and made its way to shore, and there it was, out of arm's reach, weaving and waving this way and that as it evolved its cocoon. Then, as I looked at it, it seemed to me again that, like the caterpillar I had seen last night, it saw me, and breaking out of the threads that surrounded it, it crawled down the marble leg of the Cupid and began swimming like a snake across the water of the fountain towards me. It came with extraordinary speed. The fact of a caterpillar being able to swim was new to me, and in another moment was crawling up the marble lip of the basin. Just then Inglis joined us. "Why, if it isn't old Cancer Inglisensis again," he said, catching sight of the beast. "What a tearing hurry it is in!" We were standing side by side on the path, and when the caterpillar had advanced to within about a yard of us, it stopped and began waving again as if in doubt as to the direction in which it should go. Then it appeared to make up its mind and crawled onto Inglis's shoe. "It likes me best," he said, "but I don't really know that I like it, and as it won't drown, I think perhaps—" He shook it off his shoe onto the gravel path and trod on it. All afternoon the air got heavier and heavier with the sirocco that was without doubt coming up from the south, and that night again I went up to bed feeling very sleepy. But below my drowsiness, so to speak, there was the consciousness, stronger than before, that there was something wrong in the house, that something dangerous was close at hand. But I fell asleep at once, and how long after I do not know. Either woke or dreamed I awoke, feeling that I must get up at once or I should be too late. Then, dreaming or awake, I lay and fought this fear, telling myself that I was but the prey of my own nerves disordered by sirocco or what not, and at the same time quite clearly knowing in another part of my mind, so to speak, that every moment's delay added to the danger. At last this second feeling became irresistible, and I put on coat and trousers and went out of my room onto the landing. And then I saw that I had already delayed too long, and that I was now too late. The whole of the landing of the first floor below was invisible under the swarm of caterpillars that crawled there. The folding doors into the sitting room, from which opened the bedroom where I had seen them last night, were shut, but they were squeezing through the cracks of it and dropping one by one through the keyhole, elongating themselves into mere string as they passed, and growing fat and lumpy again on emerging. Some, as if exploring, were nosing about the steps into the passage, at the end of which were Inglis's rooms. Others were crawling on the lowest steps of the staircase that led up to where I stood. The landing, however, was completely covered with them. I was cut off. And of the frozen horror that seized me when I saw that I can give no idea in words. Then at last a general movement began to take place, and they grew thicker on the steps that led to Inglis's room. Gradually, like some hideous tide of flesh, they advanced along the passage, and I saw the foremost, visible by the pale grey luminousness that came from them, reach his door. Again and again I tried to shout and warn him, in terror all the time that they would turn at the sound of my voice and mount my stair instead. But for all my efforts, I felt that no sound came from my throat. They crawled along the hinge crack of his door, passing through as they had done before, and still I stood there, making impotent efforts to shout to him, to bid him escape while there was time. At last the passage was completely empty. They had all gone, and at that moment I was conscious for the first time of the cold of the marble landing on which I stood barefooted. The dawn was just beginning to break in the eastern sky. 6 months after I met Mrs. Stanley in a country house in England, we talked on many subjects, and at last she said, I don't think I have seen you since I got that dreadful news about Arthur Inglis a month ago. I haven't heard, said I. No, he has got cancer. They don't even advise an operation, for there is no hope of a cure. He is riddled with it, the doctors say. Now, during all these 6 months, I do not think a day had passed on which I had not had in my mind the dreams, or whatever you like to call them, which I had seen in the Villa Cascana. It is awful, is it not? She continued, and I feel I can't help feeling that he may have— Caught it at the villa? I asked. She looked at me in blank surprise. Why did you say that? She asked. How did you know? Then she told me. In the unoccupied bedroom a year before there had been a fatal case of cancer. She had, of course, taken the best advice and had been told that the utmost dictates of prudence would be obeyed so long as she did not put anybody to sleep in the room, which had also been thoroughly disinfected and newly whitewashed and painted. But the end. The Singular Death of Morton by Algernon Blackwood, and read by Christopher Holton. Dusk was melting into darkness as the two men slowly made their way through the dense forest of spruce and fir that clothed the flanks of the mountain. They were weary with the long climb, for neither was in his first youth, and the July day had been a hot one. Their little inn lay further in the valley among the orchards that separated the forest from the vineyards. Neither of them talked much. The big man led the way, carrying the knapsack, and his companion, older, shorter, evidently the more fatigued of the two, followed with small footsteps. From time to time he stumbled among the loose rocks. An exceptionally observant mind would possibly have divined that his stumbling was not entirely due to fatigue, but to an absorption of spirit that made him careless how he walked. All right behind, the big man would call from time to time, half glancing back. Eh, what? The other would reply, startled out of a reverie. Pace too fast. Not a bit, I'm coming. And once he added, You might hurry on and see to supper if you feel like it. I shan't be long behind you. But his big friend did not adopt the suggestion. He kept the same distance between them. He called out the same question at intervals. Once or twice he stopped and looked back too. In this way they came at length to the skirts of the wood. A deep hush covered all the valley. The limestone ridges they had climbed gleamed down white and ghostly upon them from the fading sky. Midway in its journeys the evening wind dropped suddenly to watch the beauty of the moonlight, to hold the branches still so that the light might slip between and weave its silver pattern on the moss below. And as they stood a moment to take it in, a step sounded behind them on the soft pine needles, and the older man, still a little in the rear, turned with a start as though he had been suddenly called by name. There's that girl again, he said, and his voice expressed a curious mingling of pleasure, surprise, and apprehension. Into a patch of moonlight passed the figure of a young girl, looked at them as though about to stop, yet thinking better of it, smiled softly, and moved on out of sight into the surrounding darkness. The moon just caught her eyes and teeth so that they shone. The rest of her body stood in shadow. The effect was striking, almost as though head and shoulders hung alone in mid-air, washing them with this shining smile, then fading away. "Come on, for heaven's sake!" the big man cried. There was impatience in his manner, not unkindness. The other lingered a moment, peering closely into the gloom where the girl had vanished. His friend repeated his injunction, and a moment later the two had emerged upon the high road, with the village lights in sight beyond, and the forest left behind them like a vast mantle that held the night within its folds. For some minutes neither of them spoke. Then the big man waited for his friend to draw up alongside. "About all this valley of the Jura," he said presently, "there seems to me something rather weird." He shifted the knapsack vigorously on his back. It was a gesture of unconscious protest. "Something uncanny," he added, as he set a good pace, "but extraordinarily beautiful. It attracts you more than it does me, I think, was the short reply. The picturesque superstitions still survive here, observed the older man. They touch the imagination in spite of oneself. A pause followed, during which the other tried to increase the pace. The subject evidently made him impatient for some reason. Perhaps, he said presently, though I think myself it's due to the curious loneliness of the place. I mean, we're in the middle of tourist Europe here, yet so utterly remote. It's such a neglected little corner of the world. The contradiction bewilders. Then, being so near the frontier too, with the clock changing an hour a mile from the village, makes one think of time as unreal and imaginary. He laughed. He produced several other reasons as well. His friend admitted their value and agreed half-heartedly. He still turned occasionally to look back. The mountain ridge where they had climbed was clearly visible in the moonlight. Odd, he said, but I don't see that farmhouse where we got the milk anywhere. It ought to be easily visible from here. Hardly in this light. It was a queer place rather, I thought, he added. He did not deny the curiously suggestive atmosphere of the region. He merely wanted to find satisfactory explanations. A case in point, I mean. I didn't like it quite, that farmhouse, yet I'm hanged if I know why. It made me feel uncomfortable. That girl appeared so suddenly, although the place seemed deserted, and her silence was so odd. Why in the world couldn't she answer a single question? I'm glad I didn't take the milk. I spat it out. I'd like to know where she got it from, for there was no sign of a cow or a goat to be seen anywhere. I swallowed mine in spite of the taste, said the other, half smiling at his companion's sudden volubility. Very abruptly then the big man turned and faced his friend. Was it merely an effect of the moonlight, or had his skin really turned pale beneath the sunburn? I say, old man, he said, his face grave and serious, what do you think she was? What made her seem like that, and why the devil do you think she followed us? I think, was the slow reply, it was me she was following. The words, and particularly the tone of conviction in which they were spoken, clearly were displeasing to the big man, who already regretted having spoken so frankly what was in his mind. With a companion so imaginative, so impressionable, so nervous, it had been foolish and unwise. He led the way home at a pace that made the other arrive 5 minutes in his rear, panting, limping and perspiring as if he had been running. I'm rather for going on into Switzerland tomorrow, or the next day, he ventured that night in the darkness of their two-bedded room. I think we had enough of this place, eh? What do you think? But there was no answer from the bed across the room, for its occupant was sound asleep and snoring. Dead tired, I suppose, he muttered to himself, and then turned over to follow his friend's example. But for a long time sleep refused him. Queer, unwelcome thoughts and feelings kept him awake, of a kind he rarely knew and thoroughly disliked. It was rubbish, yet it made him uncomfortable so that his nerves tingled. He tossed about in the bed. I'm overtired, he persuaded himself. That's all. The strange feelings that kept him thus awake were not easy to analyze, perhaps, but their origin was beyond all question. They grouped themselves about the picture of that deserted, tumble-down chalet on the mountain ridge where they had stopped for refreshment a few hours before. It was a farmhouse, dilapidated and dirty, and the name stood in big black letters against a blue background on the wall above the door, La Chenille. Yet not a living soul was to be seen anywhere about it. The doors were fastened, windows shuttered, chimneys smokeless, dirt, neglect and decay everywhere in evidence. Then, suddenly, as they had turned to go, after much vain shouting and knocking at the door, a face appeared for an instant at a window, the shutter of which was half open. His friend saw it first and called aloud. The face nodded in reply, and presently a young girl came round the corner of the house, apparently by a back door, and stood staring at them both from a little distance. And from that very instant, so far as he could remember, these queer feelings had entered his heart. Fear, distrust, misgiving. The thought of it now, as he lay in bed in the darkness, made his hair rise. There was something about that girl that struck cold into the soul. Yet she was a mere slip of a thing, very pretty, seductive even, with a certain serpent-like fascination about her eyes and movements, and although she only replied to their questions as to refreshment with a smile, uttering no single word, she managed to convey the impression that she was a managing little person who might make herself very disagreeable if she chose. In spite of her undeniable charm, there was about her an atmosphere of something sinister. He himself did most of the questioning, but it was his older friend who had the benefit of her smile. Her eyes hardly ever left his face, and once she had slipped quite close to him and touched his arm. The strange part of it now seemed to him that he could not remember in the least how she was dressed, or what was the colouring of her eyes and hair. It was almost as though he had felt rather than seen her presence. The milk, she produced a jug and 2 wooden bowls after a brief disappearance round the corner of the house, was, well, it tasted so odd that he had been unable to swallow it and had spat it out. His friend, on the other hand, savage with thirst, had drunk his bowl to the last drop too quickly to taste it even, and while he drank, had kept his eyes fixed on those of the girl, who stood close in front of him. And from that moment his friend had somehow changed. On the way down he said things that were unusual, talking chiefly about the chenille and the girl, and the delicious, delicate flavour of the milk, yet all phrased in such a way that it sounded singular, unfamiliar, unpleasant even. Now that he tried to recall the sentences, the actual words evaded him, but the memory of the uneasiness and apprehension they caused him to feel remained. And night ever italicizes such memories. Then, to cap it all, the girl had followed them. It was wholly foolish and absurd to feel the things he did feel. Yet there the feelings were, and what was the good of arguing? That girl frightened him. The change in his friend was in some way or other a danger signal. More than this he could not tell. An explanation might come later, but for the present his chief desire was to get away from the place and to get his friend away too. And on this thought sleep overtook him, heavily. The windows were wide open. Outside was a garden with a rather high enclosing wall, and at the far end a gate that was kept locked because it led into private fields, and so by a back way to the cemetery and the little church. When it was open, the guests of the inn made use of it and got lost in the network of fields and vines, for there was no proper route that way to the road or the mountains. They usually ended up prematurely in the cemetery and got back to the village by passing through the church, which was always open, or by knocking at the kitchen doors of the other houses and explaining their position. Hence the gate was locked now to save trouble. After several hours of hot, unrefreshing sleep, the big man turned in his bed and woke. He tried to stretch, but couldn't, then sat up panting with a sense of suffocation. And by the faint starlight of the summer night, he saw next that his friend was up and moving about the room. Remembering that sometimes he walked in his sleep, he called to him gently. "Morton, old chap," he said in a low voice with a touch of authority in it, "go back to bed. You've walked enough for one day." And the figure, obeying as sleepwalkers often will, passed across the room and disappeared among the shadows over his bed. The other plunged and burrowed himself into a comfortable position again for sleep, but the heat of the room, the shortness of the bed, and this tiresome interruption of his slumbers made it difficult to lose consciousness. He forced his eyes to keep shut and his body to cease from fidgeting. But there was something nibbling at his mind like a spirit mouse that never permitted him to cross the frontier into actual oblivion. He slept with one eye open, as the saying is. Odours of hay and flowers and baked ground stole in through the open window. With them, too, came from time to time sounds, little sounds that disturbed him without being ever loud enough to claim definite attention. Perhaps, after all, he did lose consciousness for a moment, when suddenly a thought came with a sharp rush into his mind and galvanized him once more into utter wakefulness. It amazed him that he had not grasped it before. It was this. The figure he had seen was not the figure of his friend. Alarm gripped him at once before he could think or argue, and a cold perspiration broke out all over his body. He fumbled for matches, couldn't find them. Then, remembering there was electric light, he scraped the wall with his fingers and turned on the little white switch. In the sudden glare that filled the room, he saw instantly that his friend's bed was no longer occupied, and his mind, then acting instinctively, without process of conscious reasoning, flew like a flash to their walk of the day, to the tumble-down chenille, the glass of milk, the odd behaviour of his friend, and, to the girl. At the same second he noticed that the odour in the room, which hitherto he had taken to be the composite odour of fields, flowers and night, was really something else. It was the odour of freshly turned earth. Immediately on the top of this discovery came another. Those slight sounds he had heard outside the window were not ordinary night sounds, the murmur of wind and insects. They were footsteps moving softly, stealthily down the little paths of crushed granite. He was dressed in wonderful short order, noticing as he did so that his friend's night garments lay upon the bed, and that he too had therefore dressed. Further, that the door had been unlocked and stood half an inch ajar. There was now no question that he had slept again. Between the present and the moment when he had seen the figure, there had been a considerable interval. A couple of minutes later he had made his way cautiously downstairs and was standing on the garden path in the moonlight. And as he stood there, his mind filled with the stories the proprietor had told a few days before of the superstitions that still lived in the popular imagination and haunted this little remote pine-clad valley. The thought of that girl sickened him. The odour of newly turned earth remained in his nostrils and made his gorge rise. Utterly and vigorously he rejected the monstrous fictions he had heard, yet for all that could not prevent their touching his imagination as he stood there in the early hours of the morning, alone with night and silence. The spell was undeniable. Only a mind without sensibility could have ignored it. He searched the little garden from end to end. Empty. Opposite the high gate he stopped, peering through the iron bars, wet with dew to his hands. Far across the intervening fields he fancied something moved. A second later he was sure of it. Something down there to the right beyond the trees was astir. It was in the cemetery. And this definite discovery sent a shudder of terror and disgust through him from head to foot. He framed the name of his friend with his lips, yet the sound did not come forth. Some deeper instinct warned him to hold it back. Instead, after incredible efforts, he climbed that iron gate and dropped down into the soaking grass upon the other side. Then, taking advantage of all the cover he could find, he ran swiftly and stealthily towards the cemetery. On the way, without quite knowing why he did so, he picked up a heavy stick, and a moment later he stood beside the low wall that separated the fields from the churchyard, stood and stared. There, beside the tombstones, with their hideous metal wreaths and crowns of faded flowers, he made out the figure of his friend. He was stooping, crouched down upon the ground. Behind him rose a couple of bushy yew trees, against the dark of which his form was easily visible. He was not alone. In front of him, bending close over him it seemed, was another figure, a slight, shadowy, slim figure. This time the big man found his voice and called aloud. "Morton, Morton," he cried, "what in the name of heaven are you doing? What's the matter?" And the instant his deep voice broke the stillness of the night with its clamour, the little figure, half hiding his friend, turned about and faced him. He saw a white face with shining eyes and teeth as the form rose. The moonlight painted it with its own strange pallor. It was weird, unreal, horrible, and across the mouth, downwards from the lips to the chin, ran a deep stain of crimson. The next moment the figure slid with a queer gliding motion towards the trees and disappeared among the yews and tombstones in the direction of the church. The heavy stick hurled whirling after it fell harmlessly halfway, knocking a metal cross from its perch upon an upright grave, and the man who had thrown it raced full speed towards the huddled-up figure of his friend, hardly noticing the thin wailing cry that rose trembling through the night air from the vanished form. Nor did he notice more particularly that several of the graves, newly made, showed signs of recent disturbance, and that the odour of turned earth he had noticed in the room grew stronger. All his attention was concentrated upon the figure at his feet. "Morton, man, get up! Wake for God's sake! You've been walking in—" Then the words died upon his lips. The unnatural attitude of his friend's shoulders, and the way the head dropped back to show the neck, struck him like a blow in the face. There was no sign of movement. He lifted the body up and carried it, all limp and unresisting, by ways he never remembered afterwards, back to the inn. It was all a dreadful nightmare, a nightmare that carried over its ghastly horror into waking life. He knew that the proprietor and his wife moved busily to and fro about the bed, and that in due course the village doctor was upon the scene, and that he was giving a muddled and feverish description of all he knew, telling how his friend was a confirmed sleepwalker and all the rest. But he did not realize the truth until he saw the face of the doctor as he straightened up from the long examination. "Will you wake him?" he heard himself asking, "or let him sleep it out till morning?" And the doctor's expression, even before the reply came to confirm it, told him the truth. "Ah, monsieur, your friend will not ever wake again, I fear. It is the heart, you see. Alas, it is sudden failure of the heart." The final scenes in the little tragedy which thus brought his holiday to so abrupt and terrible a close need, no description being in no way essential to this strange story. There were one or two curious details, however, that came to light afterwards. One was that for some weeks before there had been signs of disturbance among newly made graves in the cemetery, which the authorities had been trying to trace to the nightly wanderings of the village madman. In vain. And another, that the morning after the death a trail of blood had been found across the church floor, as though someone had passed through from the back entrance to the front. A special service was held that very week to cleanse the holy building from the evil of that stain, for the villagers, deep in their superstitions, declared that nothing human had left that trail. Nothing could have made those marks but a vampire disturbed at midnight in its awful occupation among the dead. Apart from such idle rumours, however, the bereaved carried with him to this day certain other remarkable details which cannot be so easily dismissed, for he had a brief conversation with the doctor, it appears, that impressed him profoundly, and the doctor, an intelligent man, prosaic as granite into the bargain, had questioned him rather closely as to the recent life and habits of his dead friend. The account of their climb to the chenille he heard with an amazement he could not conceal. "But no such chalet exists," he said. "There is no chenille. A long time ago, 50 years or more, there was such a place, but it was destroyed by the authorities on account of the evil reputation of the people who lived there. They burnt it. Nothing remains today but a few bits of broken wall and foundation." "Evil reputation!" The doctor shrugged his shoulders. "Travellers, even peasants, disappeared," he said. "An old woman lived there with her daughter, and poisoned milk was supposed to be used, but the neighbourhood accused them of worse than ordinary murder." "In what way?" "Said the girl was a vampire," answered the doctor shortly, and after a moment's hesitation he added, turning his face away as he spoke, "It was a curious thing, though, that tiny hole in your friend's throat, small as a pinprick, yet so deep, and the heart, did I tell you, was almost completely drained of blood." The end. The Fenstanton Witch by M.R.James and read by Christopher Holton. Nicholas Hardman and Stephen Ashe were two fellows of the King's College in Cambridge. They had come, like all their contemporaries, from the sister college at Eton, where they had spent their lives from about the age of 6 to that of 16, and at the time when we encounter them, they were both men of about 30 years old. Hardman was the son of a Lincolnshire parson living at Thorganby on the Wolds, while Ash's father was a yeoman farmer of Ospringe in Kent. Hardman was black, dour and saturnine, with a rasping voice and a strong Lincolnshire accent which cannot be reproduced here. Ash had the sturdy and somewhat slow intelligence of his Kentish ancestors. The phrase "a good friend and a bad enemy" represents the opinion which the men of his year held of him. Both were in priests' orders, and each, we might suppose, looked forward in the fullness of time to occupying college livings, marrying and bringing up a son or two, one most likely to reproduce his father's career, another perhaps to go on the land and become a reputable farmer in a small way. I say we might suppose their aspirations to have been of this nature, for such was the programme of a majority of fellows of colleges at that time. But there is an entry in the book called Harwood's Alumni which shows that they entertained ideas of a very different sort. And it has occurred to me that it may be worthwhile to tell the story of what they adventured and what came of it. I have alluded more than once to their times, but I have not yet told you when they lived. Anne was filling the throne of England, Scotland, Ireland and France, and Dr. James Roderick was provost of the college, having been elected by the Fellows in preference to Sir Isaac Newton, whom the Prince of Orange, King William III of blessed memory, would have intruded into that pasture. The Fellows of Kings had vindicated their right of election, and the lower master of Eton occupied the lodge. He was known as one of the 4 smoking heads, while Sir Isaac lived in the observatory over Trinity Great Gate, and, according to popular legends, gently remonstrated with his dog Diamond, or cut holes in his door to admit his cat and kitten. The university was a happy, sleepy place in those days, one is apt to think. But after all, what with the church in danger and the excitement of depriving Dr. Richard Bentley, then Master of Trinity, of his degrees, there was probably no lack of sport to be had within the precincts, and certainly just outside them there was more than there is now. Snipe were shot on Parker's Piece, and the dreary expanse of undrained fen was the haunt of many a strange fowl, not to speak of other inhabitants of whom I may one day find an occasion to tell. But it is time to leave generalities. The 2 sheep to whom we must return, and I am afraid they were black ones, were very close friends. But few men in the university, or indeed in the King's College itself, could boast of more than a speaking acquaintance with either. They occupied one room in the old School of Kings, north of the chapel, which room was always locked when they were out. And these were not days when fellows, nor still less scholars, were in the habit of dropping into each other's abodes to partake of casual hospitality in the way of tobacco or whisky and water. The common life, such as it was confined to chapel hall and the fellows' parlour. All that was known of Hardman and Ash's way of employing their leisure was that they went for long walks together and smoked apparently very bad tobacco when they came back. It was a fine afternoon in October when these events began, or to speak more truly, came to a head, which served to show what manner of men were Nicholas Hardman and Stephen Ash. Chapel service, we may be sure, was at 3, and both of our friends were there, staring at each other from opposite stalls. The reedy and pedal-less organ helped the rather infirm and jaded choir through a new verse anthem by Dr. Blow, during which the snoring of Provost Roderick was not doubtfully heard. At near 4, Dr. Tudway, the organist, played out the scant congregation with a march of his own composition. The choirmen hurried off to go through a similar performance at Trinity. The boys rushed off to whatever haunts in the town they had emerged from. The provost strolled to his lodge, then at the eastern end of the chapel, and the fellows and scholars made their way across the strip of ground on the north side, holding on their caps, for a strong west wind was blowing the yellow leaves about, and so into the old court and to dine in hall. A coarse meal, I expect it was, and a silent one. The vice-provost and 3 or 4 seniors occupied one table on the dais. The masters of art, among whom were Hardman and Ash, filled a second along with the fellow commoners, and the bachelors and undergraduate fellows and scholars 2 more. There may have been 50 people in the room. Not much passed at dinner, which lasted about 40 minutes, but afterwards the fellows returned to the parlour and the scholars to their rooms. With these last we are not concerned, but we may as well follow the seniors. They are sitting at a large table, clothless, with some decanters of wine. I don't know whether port or claret, much depends upon the date of Lord Methuen's treaty with Portugal, and something like conversation has broken out. "Where did you ride today, Mr. Bates?" said Mr. Glynn. "Only so far as Fenstanton." "Fenstanton? Ah, is that where the witch was ducked last week? Lord Blandford was riding by at the time." This was the Duke of Marlborough's son and heir, who died shortly afterwards and was now a fellow commoner. "And his lordship made some hot-headed show at rescuing the old creature. Has there been any stir made? Dodgson of Magdalen has this living, but I doubt, if he hath not moved, no one will. 'Tis a lost place, Fenstanton, for all it be on the Huntingdon road." Thus far Mr. Glynn, who had rather a knack of monopolising conversation. "Well, to tell truth," says Bates, "I had not heard of the matter, but the bell was tolling for a burying as I rode through, and I happened to meet Dodgson coming from his beer and pipe, as I judged, to the churchyard. He did let fall something which could fit with what you say. Pray, did you hear the name Glynn, Galpin, or Gibson? Some word with a G in it." "Gibson! Mother Gibson! That was the name for a guinea, so that ducking has finished the poor creature," said good-natured Glynn. "These fen rustics are little but brutes. I vow the coroner should have sat, and there should have been a dozen strung up at the assizes, and in any but Dodgson's parish there would have been. But Lord, the man thinks of nothing but his tithes and his beer." "Matthews had the parsonage before Dodgson," said Bates, "and in his time there were 4 attempts at swimming that old woman. Not a boy nor man in the parish, he told me, but was ready to swear she had signed herself away. But Matthews threatened to call in the sheriff, and he would have done it too, so they kept mum in his time." "For all that," said Glynn, "I remember his saying in this parlour that when he looked at her, he was half in a mind to believe the tale. He pointed her out to me one day, and it is sure that she might have sat for a portrait of the enemy, as far as her eyes were concerned. They were as red as blood, and the pupils like a goat's." With which Mr. Glynn was silent and shuddered slightly. "Did they bury her in the churchyard, Bates?" said Dr. Morrell, the vice-provost. "Yes, Mr. Vice-Provost, I noticed a grave dug on the north side, which I take it was for her." All this talk about burying witches puts me in mind of William of Malmesbury's tale that Dr. Gale printed not so long back. This was from a new contributor to the conversation, Mr. Newborough, afterwards headmaster of Eton, who was more bookishly inclined than many of his compeers. "Do you know it, Mr. Glynn? You should look at Malmesbury." And he proceeded to tell the story which Southey has put into rhyme under the name of the old woman of Berkeley. After that came a short discussion of the Witch of Endor. Then the conversation drifted to Dr. Hodey's book on the versions of the Bible, then by a not uncommon fate to Dr. Bentley's Last Enormities, and thence back to the familiar question of college livings and probable vacancies. In the midst of this, Hardman and Ash made their bow to the vice-provost and went out. They had neither of them made any remarks since dinner, but Dr. Morrell, an observant man, noticed that they had taken a very considerable interest in the early part of the conversation. "2 dull dogs gone," said Dr. Glynn when the door closed behind them. "I pity their wives if ever they marry, and their parishes if ever they take 'em." "Quiet enough if they are dull," said Newborough. "I don't know that, Newborough," said Morrell. "The man that has chambers under theirs doesn't always sleep best. What can keep those 2 men treading about the whole night, as I am told they do, and what have they on their minds that makes them sigh and moan like 2 sick owls, as Burton says? You know everyone in college, Glyn. Tell us, pray, were you ever in Hardman's and Ash's chambers? Not I, said Glyn. I knocked at their door one day, I recollect last year. Such a clatter as they made before they opened it, I vow I never heard. But all I can tell of the matter is that Hardman was as pale as a ghost when he opened to me, and that the place smelt as sweet as a bonfire of old rags and bones. Hardman made shift to ask my business, and then shut the door in my face. Well, said the Vice-Provost, he might have spared himself the question, Glyn. I never knew you have any business in this life yet. Never matter. 'Tis time to turn unto the coffee-house, gentlemen. I have told Dr. Coates we should be there before 8, and the clocks are going the quarter now. The company adjourned, therefore, to a coffee-house on the market-place, and smoked clay pipes till 10 with Dr. Roger Coates and some other gentlemen from Trinity Queen's and Benet colleges. The curfew bell was ringing, and it was a fine night when Hardman and Ash, each with a packet and a stick, emerged from the gates of King's College and told the porter, a fuddling old ruffian, as were most college servants of that day, that they were not like to be returning that night. Neither said any word until they were clear of the town and on the Huntingdon road. Then said Nicholas Hardman, If all goes as it should tonight, Ash, we shall know a matter worth knowing. Yes, Nick, and there will be a matter worth having in one of these bundles, said Ash. I dare swear, though, that there will be some disappointment. Newborough's tale of the old witch set me a-thinking. You have the book upon you, Nick. Book? What book? Dr. Gales's print of Malmesbury, I suppose. A fat folio of a stone weight. It is likely. No, not Malmesbury. Our book, the book, I mean. Call me fool if you like, Stephen, but don't ask such another question. Have I come forth without my head? That is as likely as it would be for me to leave the book in my chambers. But why, pray, does that ass Newborough's old stories set you thinking? Why, only that if the same gentry that came for their friend in that story were thinking of waiting upon our friend at Fenstanton tonight, it is like we may see trouble. Hardman gave a snort. And if they did, do you think a circle is broken so easily? Have I nothing here that avails to make them give back? Still, you are right in a way, Stephen, as you have been before. If we are later in the field than they, there may be trouble, even danger. But what we would have, it's not what they want. If we get the 3 locks of hair and the winding sheet, we are masters of the elementals. The others want the soul. It was a thought that seemed to dash both of them for a moment, and they were silent. So the clouds flew across the moon, and the wind blew over the bare fields, and the bells of Cambridge came more faintly to the ear as they walked quietly on towards the sleeping village of Fenstanton. Those who remember the road between Cambridge and Fenstanton will bear me out when I say that it is 11 miles long and presents few features of interest. There is an occasional wayside inn, a few farms lie a little off the road, and on a clear day we may see the lantern and western tower of Ely, and a good many nearer church towers. The church that lies nearest to the road is that of Lulworth, on the left hand, some 5 or 6 miles out. There was something doing at Lulworth when Hardman and Ash passed it. The bell was going, and the windows lighted. Nocturnal funerals were almost the rule in Queen Anne's time for anyone who claimed to be a magnate, so that it did not surprise the lookers-on when they saw 2 lines of torches working their way slowly through the trees near the church, and when they saw a figure in white flit out of the south porch to meet the cortege, they knew that it must be the parson. Yet a few moments and the procession was in the church. Then they walked on again, for they had paused a moment. The turning out of the main road towards Lulworth Church lay some little distance ahead, and down the lane were coming a group of figures at a great pace. They reached the road and turned down it towards the travellers, who were a little daunted thereby because they did not wish to be recognised as Cambridge parsons at that hour of the night. There appeared to be 7 people clustering around one in the midst, and their action and gait was like that of watchmen who had taken a prisoner. The party came on, and it seemed as if this conjecture might fit the situation, for the person in the midst was plainly reluctant, and as plainly was being hurried on by the rest. Hardman and Ash drew towards the hedge to let these men pass, and their eyes were riveted upon the face of the captured man. It was not lightly to be forgotten, for it is not often that anyone beholds the face of a man who has lost all hope, and yet has room in his brain for an unspeakable fear. This is the sight which those two ill-starred priests were now looking upon. And they saw, moreover, that in spite of his terror and desperation, the captive could look nowhere save straight in front of him, for anything seemed tolerable rather than to see the faces of the 7 who were about him. When they pictured the scene to themselves thereafter, they realized that his was the only face of which they had caught sight at all. Nay, it even seemed to them that there was no other face for their eyes to catch. The thing was past. It passed quite silently, and for many moments these 2 men stayed breathless to within an ace of sudden flight or swooning. They knew that they had seen that which no mourner at that funeral had seen, and it was in their minds that it is not always well for those whose eyes are opened. It may happen to some to see the mountains full of bones and chariots of fire, but to others are shown very different sights from that. Yet the natures of both were so obstinate and dogged that neither would broach to the other the thought of returning and giving up the dismal project they had in their minds. They went on. Soon they sighted Fenstanton's spire, and 1/2 mile further they left the road and made their way across the fields to the side where the churchyard was accessible away from the street. It was not a difficult wall to climb, yet they were unnerved and took several minutes to get over it. Then they proceeded to go through the sinister rites and ceremonies which were to safeguard them against those powers with whom they supposed themselves to be leagued, for they are treacherous allies, as those tell us who claim to know the heart of the matter. On the north side of the dark church, even in its shadow, and not more than 10 yards from a new-made grave, the only one on that side of the building, they picked out a space where the grass was shortest, and drew 2 large circles, one within the other. And in the space between the circles they marked out with some pains the symbols of the planets, and a few Hebrew letters which were meant to indicate names of angels, and of the great power, whose aid, by one of the strange contradictions of art magic, they promised themselves they would gain for the work they were at. When their defence was completed, they stopped, and Ash looked at his timepiece. The hour was something short of 11:45, so they must wait till the middle of night was reached. And now, what was it that these 2 educated clergymen proposed to themselves, and how came it that they were on an enterprise which one associates, not always correctly, with the darkest medievalism and the most defective civilization? You have guessed that they were earnest and credulous students of art magic. How came such men to be in Cambridge in the reign of Queen Anne? I can only answer that in that day there were many such men in Germany, and that the instinct which prompts men to seek intercourse with the unseen peoples of the air is one that may come to the surface in any civilization and in any century. Many have a sneaking idea that the intercourse has been sometimes gained, but that is little to the point. That which Hardman and Ash were determined upon was the obtaining of an ingredient for future spells, which should end in making them able to command the forces of nature to a degree which they believed many to have attained before them. They meant on this night, and they were confident of accomplishing it, to go through certain forms of words which would have power to make the corpse of the old woman buried that day to arise out of the grave and come to them, and give them, it is horrid to think of, the portion of the grave clothes and the locks of hair of which Hardman spoke when they were on the road. Then should the body return to the earth as it was, and the soil be replaced above it. They were to go back to their college the next day, and in 7 days' time who so rich and powerful as Nicholas Hardman and Stephen Ash, Esquires? It was with a strange kind of exultation that, as midnight came near, Hardman drew from his bosom a paper book, about 100 years old, ill-written and full of diagrams like that which had just been drawn upon the ground, and within whose compass both of them were standing. He began to read or intone a Latin form of conjuration, a sinister kind of church service, in which the most sacred of names were freely employed, and to this Ash made the set appointed refrains. The night had been disturbed throughout and windy, but no rain had fallen, and the thin clouds kept covering the moon, which was by this time low and near the horizon. The wind rattled in the louvres of the tower, and every now and then swung the tongue of a bell so that it sounded in a dim and far-off fashion. Nicholas Hardman read on, and read faster and louder, and Ash responded at short intervals. They had now entered upon the 91st Psalm, Qui habitat, whoso dwelleth, and they were just promising themselves deliverance from the terror that walks in darkness, when a blacker cloud than usual left the moon's face, and Stephen Ash fell like an ox at the feet of Hardman. For it seems that it had been determined that these fools should be answered according to their folly. I have said that the miserable and criminous old woman whom the Fenmen had killed was buried a bare 10 yards away from the two conjurers, and their eyes were often fixed upon her grave, as upon the point to which their spells were directed. Looking over at the grave, Hardman beheld crouched upon it a shape which there was small likelihood of his ever forgetting. It was the figure, one would say at first sight, of an enormous bat with folded wings and hints of head approaching the human form. In a short moment Hardman caught sight of the folds of wrinkled skin or hide that hung down from the cheeks, of the wide ears which shone transparent in the moonlight, and of the 2 lines of dusky red fire which marked the almost closed eyes. And further, he declared afterwards, he saw the earth heap upon which this being was crouched stir and wave beneath it. Not long was he allowed to remain a spectator, for this terrific appearance rose to its height, and for a minute seemed to look about as if for a victim whom it knew to be near. Hardman, almost at the pitch of despair, yet trusted dimly in his charmed circle. But the creature on a sudden turned full in his direction and stepped swift and straight towards him, not flinching for an instant at angelic names or planetary symbols. In another moment its talons were raised toward his face, and he knew no more. It was Ash who helped him back to Cambridge in the morning of the next day, and it was Ash also who, for the 20 years that he survived, sheltered him in the parsonage of Willerton and ministered to him, himself a stricken man. But Hardman never saw light again. The college at large never learned the rights of the story. 2 days after the catastrophe, Mr. Glynn says to Mr. Morrell, being Vice Provost, "What did you do at the seniors' meeting this morning, Mr. Vice?" "Sealed the presentation to Weed and Lois and received a declaration, Glynn." "A royal declaration, or what?" "No, Glynn, Mr. Provost will tell you about it maybe if you ask him." So off goes Mr. Glynn to the lodge. But Provost Roderick is pale, which is not natural to him, and not smoking, which is decidedly unnatural, and disturbed and uncommunicative. And Mr. Glynn can only learn that it is a matter which the seniors have decided to keep private. During the next week a barrowload of matters from one set of chambers in the King's College is wheeled off in the direction of Barton and does not come back. And most of the seniors are very regular in their attendance in the chapel for some months. I cannot help connecting these events I have set down with that entry in the Protocollum book, which states that 2 gentlemen, being fellows of the college, were permitted to register a solemn abjuration of all unlawful acts in the practising of which they had grievously transgressed, and that it was agreed that the provost and seniors shall exercise their utmost discretion to the end that this matter be kept strictly private to the seniority. The end. Negotium Perambulans by E.F.Benson, and read by Christopher Holton. The casual tourist in West Cornwall may just possibly have noticed, as he bowled along over the bare high plateau between Penzance and the Land's End, a dilapidated signpost pointing down a steep lane and bearing on its battered finger the faded inscription, Polyon 2 miles. But probably very few have had the curiosity to traverse those 2 miles in order to see a place to which their guidebooks award so cursory a notice. It is described there in a couple of unattractive lines as a small fishing village with a church of no particular interest, except for certain carved and painted wooden panels, originally belonging to an earlier edifice, which form an altar rail. But the church at St. Crede, the tourist is reminded, has a similar decoration far superior in point of preservation and interest, and thus even the ecclesiastically disposed are not lured to Polyon. So meagre a bait is scarce worth swallowing, and a glance at the very steep lane which in dry weather presents a carpet of sharp-pointed stones, and after rain a muddy watercourse, will almost certainly decide him not to expose his motor or his bicycle to risks like these in so sparsely populated a district. Hardly a house has met his eyes since he left Penzance, and the possible trundling of a punctured bicycle for half a dozen weary miles seems a high price to pay for the sight of a few painted panels. Polyon, therefore, even in the high noon of the tourist season, is little liable to invasion, and for the rest of the year I do not suppose that a couple of folk a day traverse those 2 miles, long ones at that, of steep and stony gradient. I am not forgetting the postman in this exiguous estimate, for the days are few when, leaving his pony and cart at the top of the hill, he goes as far as the village, since but a few hundred yards down the lane there stands a large white box like a sea trunk by the side of the road, with a slit for letters and a locked door. Should he have in his wallet a registered letter, or be the bearer of a parcel too large for insertion in the square lips of the sea trunk, he must needs trudge down the hill and deliver the troublesome missive, leaving it in person on the owner, and receiving some small reward of coin or refreshment for his kindness. But such occasions are rare, and his general routine is to take out of the box such letters as may have been deposited there, and insert in their place such letters as he has brought. These will be called for perhaps that day or perhaps the next by an emissary from the Polyon post office. As for the fishermen of the place, who in their export trade constitute the chief link of movement between Polyon and the outside world, they would not dream of taking their catch up the steep lane, and so with 6 miles farther of travel, to the market at Penzance. The sea route is shorter and easier, and they deliver their wares to the pierhead. Thus, though the sole industry of Polyon is sea fishing, you will get no fish there unless you have bespoken your requirements to one of the fishermen. Back come the trawlers as empty as a haunted house, while their spoils are in the fish train that is speeding to London. Such isolation of a little community, continued as it has been for centuries, produces isolation in the individual as well, and nowhere will you find greater independence of character than among the people of Polyon. But they are linked together, so it has always seemed to me by some mysterious comprehension. It is as if they had all been initiated into some ancient rite, inspired and framed by forces visible and invisible. The winter storms that batter the coast, the vernal spell of the spring, the hot still summers, the season of rains and autumnal decay, have made a spell which, line by line, has been communicated to them concerning the powers, evil and good, that rule the world and manifest themselves in ways benignant or terrible. I came to Polyon first at the age of 10, a small boy, weak and sickly, and threatened with pulmonary trouble. My father's business kept him in London, while for me abundance of fresh air and a mild climate were considered essential conditions if I was to grow to manhood. His sister had married the vicar of Polyon, Richard Bolitho, himself native to the place, and so it came about that I spent 3 years as a paying guest with my relations. Richard Bolitho owned a fine house in the place, which he inhabited in preference to the vicarage, which he let to a young artist, John Evans, on whom the spell of Polyon had fallen, for from year's beginning to year's end he never left it. There was a solid roof shelter, open on one side to the air, built for me in the garden, and here I lived and slept, passing scarcely 1 hour out of the 24 behind walls and windows. I was out on the bay with the fisher folk, or wandering along the gorse-clad cliffs that climbed steeply to right and left of the deep combe where the village lay, or pottering about on the pierhead, or birds nesting in the bushes with the boys of the village. Except on Sunday, and for the few daily hours of my lessons, I might do what I pleased, so long as I remained in the open air. About the lessons there was nothing formidable. My uncle conducted me through flowering bypaths among the thickets of arithmetic, and made pleasant excursions into the elements of Latin grammar, and above all, he made me daily give him an account, in clear and grammatical sentences, of what had been occupying my mind or my movements. Should I select to tell him about a walk along the cliffs, my speech must be orderly, not vague slipshod notes of what I had observed. In this way, too, he trained my observation, for he would bid me tell him what flowers were in bloom, and what birds hovered fishing over the sea or were building in the bushes. For that I owe him a perennial gratitude, for to observe and to express my thoughts in the clear-spoken word became my life's profession. But far more formidable than my weekday tasks was the prescribed routine for Sunday. Some dark embers compounded of Calvinism and mysticism smouldered in my uncle's soul, and made it a day of terror. His sermon in the morning scorched us with a foretaste of the eternal fires reserved for unrepentant sinners, and he was hardly less terrifying at the children's service in the afternoon. Well do I remember his exposition of the doctrine of guardian angels. A child, he said, might think himself secure in such angelic care, but let him beware of committing any of those numerous offences which would cause his guardian to turn his face from him. For as sure as there were angels to protect us, there were also evil and awful presences which were ready to pounce, and on them he dwelt with peculiar gusto. Well, too, do I remember in the morning sermon his commentary on the carved panels of the altar rails, to which I have already alluded. There was the angel of the Annunciation there, and the angel of the Resurrection, but not less was there the Witch of Endor. And on the fourth panel, a scene that concerned me most of all. This fourth panel, he came down from his pulpit to trace its time-worn features, represented the lich gate of the churchyard at Polion itself, and indeed the resemblance when thus pointed out was remarkable. In the entry stood the figure of a robed priest holding up a cross, with which he faced a terrible creature like a gigantic slug that reared itself up in front of him. That, so ran my uncle's interpretation, was some evil agency such as he had spoken about to us children, of almost infinite malignity and power, which could alone be combated by firm faith and a pure heart. Below ran the legend Negotium Perambulans in Tenebris, from the 91st Psalm. We should find it translated there, the pestilence that walketh in darkness, which but feebly rendered the Latin. It was more deadly to the soul than any pestilence that can only kill the body. It was the thing, the creature, the business that trafficked in the outer darkness, a minister of God's wrath on the unrighteous. I could see as he spoke the looks which the congregation exchanged with each other, and knew that his words were evoking a surmise, a remembrance. Nods and whispers passed between them. They understood to what he alluded, and with the inquisitiveness of boyhood I could not rest till I had wormed the story out of my friends among the fisher boys, as next morning we sat basking and naked in the sun after our bathe. One knew one bit of it, one another, but it pieced together into a truly alarming legend. In bald outline it was as follows. A church far more ancient than that in which my uncle terrified us every Sunday had once stood not 300 yards away, on the shelf of a level ground below the quarry from which its stones were hewn. The owner of the land had pulled this down, and erected for himself a house on the same site out of these materials, keeping in a very ecstasy of wickedness the altar, and on this he dined and played dice afterwards. But as he grew old, some black melancholy seized him, and he would have lights burning there all night, for he had deadly fear of the darkness. On one winter evening there sprang up such a gale as was never before known, which broke in the windows of the room where he had supped and extinguished the lamps. Yells of terror brought in his servants, who found him lying on the floor with the blood streaming from his throat. As they entered, some huge black shadow seemed to move away from him, crawled across the floor and up the wall and out of the broken window. "There he lay a-dying," said the last of my informants, "and him that had been a great burly man was withered to a bag of skin, for the critter had drained all the blood from him. His last breath was a scream, and he hollered out the same words as Passon read off the screen." "Negotium Perambulans in Tenebris," I suggested eagerly. "Thereabouts, Latin anyhow." "And after that," I asked, "nobody would go near the place, and the old house rotted and fell in ruins till 3 years ago, when along comes Mr. Doolis from Penzance and built the half of it up again. But he don't care much about such critters, nor about Latin neither. He takes his bottle of whisky a day and gets drunk, Sir Lord, in the evening. Hey, I'm gwine home to my dinner." Whatever the authenticity of the legend, I had certainly heard the truth about Mr. Doolis from Penzance, who from that day became an object of keen curiosity on my part, the more so because the quarry house adjoined my uncle's garden. The thing that walked in the dark failed to stir my imagination, and already I was so used to sleeping alone in my shelter that the night had no terrors for me. But it would be intensely exciting to wake at some timeless hour and hear Master Doolis yelling and conjecture that the thing had got him. But by degrees the whole story faded from my mind, overscored by the more vivid interests of the day. And for the last 2 years of my outdoor life in the vicarage garden, I seldom thought about Mr. Doolis and the possible fate that might await him for his temerity in living in the place where that thing of darkness had done business. Occasionally I saw him over the garden fence, a great yellow lump of a man, with slow and staggering gait, but never did I set eyes on him outside his gate, either in the village street or down on the beach. He interfered with none, and no one interfered with him. If he wanted to run the risk of being the prey of the legendary nocturnal monster, or quietly drink himself to death, it was his affair. My uncle, so I gathered, had made several attempts to see him when first he came to live at Poleyarn, but Mr. Doolis appeared to have no use for parsons, but said he was not at home and never returned the call. After 3 years of sun, wind and rain, I had completely outgrown my early symptoms and had become a tough, strapping youngster of 13. I was sent to Eton and Cambridge, and in due course ate my dinners and became a barrister. In 20 years from that time I was earning a yearly income of 5 figures, and had already laid by in sound securities a sum that brought me dividends which would, for one of my simple tastes and frugal habits, supply me with all the material comforts I needed on this side of the grave. The great prizes of my profession were already within my reach, but I had no ambition beckoning me on, nor did I want a wife and children, being, I must suppose, a natural celibate. In fact, there was only one ambition which through these busy years had held the lure of blue and far-off hills to me, and that was to get back to Poleyarn and live once more isolated from the world, with the sea and the gorse-clad hills for playfellows, and the secrets that lurked there for exploration. The spell of it had been woven about my heart, and I can truly say that there had hardly passed a day in all those years in which the thought of it and the desire for it had been wholly absent from my mind. Though I had been in frequent communication with my uncle there during his lifetime, and after his death, with his widow who still lived there, I had never been back to it since I embarked on my profession, for I knew that if I went there, it would be a wrench beyond my power to tear myself away again. But I had made up my mind that when once I had provided for my own independence, I would go back there not to leave it again. And yet I did leave it again, and now nothing in the world would induce me to turn down the lane from the road that leads from Penzance to the Land's End, and see the sides of the combe rise steep above the roofs of the village, and hear the gulls chiding as they fish in the bay. One of the things invisible of the dark powers leapt into light, and I saw it with my eyes. The house where I had spent those 3 years of boyhood had been left for life to my aunt, and when I made known to her my intention of coming back to Pollyarn, she suggested that till I found a suitable house or found her proposal unsuitable, I should come to live with her. "The house is too big for a lone old woman," she wrote, "and I have often thought of quitting and taking a little cottage sufficient for me and my requirements. But come and share it, my dear, and if you find me troublesome, you or I can go. You may want solitude, most people in Pollyarn do, and will leave me, or else I will leave you. One of the main reasons of my stopping here all these years was a feeling that I must not let the old house starve. Houses starve, you know, if they are not lived in. They die a lingering death, the spirit in them grows weaker and weaker, and at last fades out of them. Isn't this nonsense to your London notions?" Naturally, I accepted with warmth this tentative arrangement, and on an evening in June found myself at the head of the lane leading down to Pollyarn, and once more I descended into the steep valley between the hills. Time had stood still apparently, for the combe, the dilapidated signpost, or its successor, pointed a rickety finger down the lane, and a few 100 yards farther on was the white box for the exchange of letters. Point after remembered point met my eye, and what I saw was not shrunk, as is often the case with the revisited scenes of childhood, into a smaller scale. There stood the post office, and there the church, and close beside it the vicarage, and beyond the tall shrubberies which separated the house for which I was bound from the road, and beyond that again the grey roofs of the quarry house, damp and shining with the moist evening wind from the sea. All was exactly as I remembered it, and above all that sense of seclusion and isolation. Somewhere above the treetops climbed the lane which joined the main road to Penzance, but all that had become immeasurably distant. The years that had passed since last I turned in at the well-known gate faded like a frosty breath and vanished in this warm, soft air. There were law courts somewhere in memory's dull book which, if I cared to turn the pages, would tell me that I had made a name and a great income there. But the dull book was closed now, for I was back in Pollyarn, and the spell was woven around me again. And if Pollyarn was unchanged, so too was Aunt Hester, who met me at the door. Dainty and china white she had always been, and the years had not aged but only refined her. As we sat and talked after dinner, she spoke of all that had happened in Pollyarn in that score of years, and yet somehow the changes of which she spoke seemed but to confirm the immutability of it all. As the recollection of names came back to me, I asked her about the quarry house and Mr. Doolis, and her face gloomed a little as with the shadow of a cloud on a spring day. "Yes, Mr. Doolis," she said. "Poor Mr. Doolis! How well I remember him, though it must be 10 years and more since he died. I never wrote to you about it, for it was all very dreadful, my dear, and I did not want to darken your memories of Pollyarn. Your uncle always thought that something of the sort might happen if he went on in his wicked drunken ways, and worse than that, and though nobody knew exactly what took place, it was the sort of thing that might have been anticipated." "But what more or less happened, Aunt Hester?" I asked. "Well, of course I can't tell you everything, for no one knew it, but he was a very sinful man, and the scandal about him at New Lynn was shocking, and then he lived too in the quarry house. I wonder if by any chance you remember a sermon of your uncle's when he got out of the pulpit and explained that panel in the altar rails, the one, I mean, with the horrible creature rearing itself up outside the lich gate?" "Yes, I remember perfectly," said I. "Ah, it made an impression on you, I suppose, and so it did on all who heard him, and that impression got stamped and branded on us all when the catastrophe occurred. Somehow Mr. Doolis got to hear about your uncle's sermon, and in some drunken fit he broke into the church and smashed the panel to atoms. He seems to have thought that there was some magic in it, and that if he destroyed that, he would get rid of the terrible fate that was threatening him. For I must tell you that before he committed that dreadful sacrilege, he had been a haunted man. He hated and feared darkness, for he thought that the creature on the panel was on his track, but that as long as he kept lights burning it could not touch him. But the panel, to his disordered mind, was the root of his terror, and so, as I said, he broke into the church and attempted, you will see why I said attempted, to destroy it. It certainly was found in splinters next morning when your uncle went into church for matins, and knowing Mr. Doolis's fear of the panel, he went across to the quarry house afterwards and taxed him with its destruction. The man never denied it, he boasted of what he had done. There he sat, though it was early morning, drinking his whisky. "I've settled your thing for you," he said, "and your sermon too. A fig for such superstitions." Your uncle left him without answering his blasphemy, meaning to go straight into Penzance and give information to the police about this outrage to the church. But on his way back from the quarry house, he went into the church again, in order to be able to give details about the damage, and there in the screen was the panel, untouched and uninjured. And yet he had himself seen it smashed, and Mr. Doolis had confessed that the destruction of it was his work. But there it was, and whether the power of God had mended it or some other power, who knows? This was Polyan indeed, and it was the spirit of Polyan that made me accept all Aunt Hester was telling me as a tested fact. It had happened like that, she went on in her quiet voice. Your uncle recognized that some power beyond police was at work, and he did not go to Penzance or give information about the outrage, for the evidence of it had vanished. A sudden spate of scepticism swept over me. There must have been some mistake, I said. It hadn't been broken. She smiled. Yes, my dear, but you have been in London so long, she said. Let me anyhow tell you the rest of my story. That night, for some reason, I could not sleep. It was very hot and airless. I dare say you will think that these sultry conditions accounted for my wakefulness. Once and again, as I went to the window to see if I could not admit more air, I could see from it the quarry house, and I noticed the first time that I left my bed that it was blazing with lights. But the second time I saw that it was all in darkness, and as I wondered at that, I heard a terrible scream, and the moment afterwards the steps of someone coming at full speed down the road outside the gate. He yelled as he ran. "Light, light," he called out. "Give me light, or it will catch me." It was very terrible to hear that, and I went to rouse my husband, who was sleeping in the dressing room across the passage. He wasted no time, but by now the whole village was aroused by the screams, and when he got down to the pier, he found that all was over. The tide was low, and on the rocks at its foot was lying the body of Mr. Doolis. He must have cut some artery when he fell on those sharp edges of stone, for he had bled to death, they thought, and though he was a big burly man, his corpse was but skin and bones. Yet there was no pool of blood round him, such as you would have expected, just skin and bones, as if every drop of blood in his body had been sucked out of him. She leaned forward. "You and I, my dear, know what happened," she said, "or at least can guess. God has his instruments of vengeance on those who bring wickedness into places that have been holy. Dark and mysterious are his ways. Now, what I should have thought of such a story if it had been told me in London, I can easily imagine. There was such an obvious explanation. The man in question had been a drunkard. What wonder if the demons of delirium pursued him? But here in Polyan it was different. "And who is in the quarry house now?" I asked. "Years ago the Fisher boys told me the story of the man who first built it, and of his horrible end. And now again it has happened. Surely no one has ventured to inhabit it once more." I saw in her face, even before I asked that question, that somebody had done so. "Yes, it is lived in again," said she, "for there is no end to the blindness. I don't know if you remember him. He was tenant of the vicarage many years ago." "John Evans," said I. "Yes, such a nice fellow he was too. Your uncle was pleased to get so good a tenant, and now—" She rose. "Aunt Hester, you shouldn't leave your sentences unfinished," I said. She shook her head. "My dear, that sentence will finish itself," she said. "But what a time of night! I must go to bed, and you too, or they will think we have to keep lights burning here through the dark hours." Before getting into bed, I drew my curtains wide and opened all the windows to the warm tide of the sea air that flowed softly in. Looking out into the garden, I could see in the moonlight the roof of the shelter, in which for 3 years I had lived, gleaming with dew. That, as much as anything, brought back the old days to which I had now returned, and they seemed of one piece with the present, as if no gap of more than 20 years sundered them. The two flowed into one like globules of mercury, uniting into a softly shining globe of mysterious lights and reflections. Then, raising my eyes a little, I saw against the black hillside the windows of the quarry house still alight. Morning, as is so often the case, brought no shattering of my illusion. As I began to regain consciousness, I fancied that I was a boy again, waking up in the shelter in the garden, and though, as I grew more widely awake, I smiled at the impression that on which it was based I found to be indeed true. It was sufficient now, as then, to be here, to wander again on the cliffs, and hear the popping of the ripened seed pods on the gorse bushes, to stray along the shore to the bathing cove, to float and drift and swim in the warm tide and bask on the sand, and watch the gulls fishing, to lounge on the pierhead with the fisher folk, to see in their eyes and hear in their quiet speech the evidence of secret things not so much known to them as part of their instincts and their very being. There were powers and presences about me. The white poplars that stood by the stream that babbled down the valley knew of them, and showed a glimpse of their knowledge sometimes, like the gleam of their white underleaves. The very cobbles that paved the street were soaked in it. All that I wanted was to lie there and grow soaked in it too. Unconsciously, as a boy, I had done that. But now the process must be conscious. I must know what stir of forces, fruitful and mysterious, seethed along the hillside at noon and sparkled at night on the sea. They could be known, they could even be controlled by those who were masters of the spell, but never could they be spoken of, for they were dwellers in the innermost, grafted into the eternal life of the world. There were dark secrets as well as these clear, kindly powers, and to these no doubt belonged the Negotium Perambulans in Tenebris, which, though of deadly malignity, might be regarded not only as evil, but as the avenger of sacrilegious and impious deeds. All this was part of the spell of Polyan, of which the seeds had long lain dormant in me, but now they were sprouting, and who knew what strange flower would unfold on their stems? It was not long before I came across John Evans. One morning, as I lay on the beach, there came shambling across the sand a man stout and middle-aged with the face of Silenus. He paused as he drew near and regarded me from narrow eyes. "Why, you're the little chap that used to live in the parson's garden," he said. "Don't you recognize me?" I saw who it was when he spoke. His voice, I think, instructed me, and recognizing it, I could see the features of the strong, alert young man in this gross caricature. "Yes, you're John Evans," I said. "You used to be very kind to me. You used to draw pictures for me." "So I did, and I'll draw you some more. Been bathing? That's a risky performance. You never know what lives in the sea, nor what lives on the land for that matter. Not that I heed them. I stick to work and whiskey. God, I've learned to paint since I saw you, and drink too for that matter. I live in the quarry house, you know, and it's a powerful thirsty place. Come and have a look at my things if you're passing. Staying with your aunt, are you? I could do a wonderful portrait of her. Interesting face, she knows a lot. People who live at Polyan get to know a lot, though I don't take much stock in that sort of knowledge myself. I do not know when I have been at once so repelled and interested. Behind the mere grossness of his face, there lurked something which, while it appalled, yet fascinated me. His thick, lisping speech had the same quality, and his paintings, what would they be like? "I was just going home," I said. "I'll gladly come in if you'll allow me." He took me through the untended and overgrown garden into the house which I had never yet entered. A great grey cat was sunning itself in the window, and an old woman was laying lunch in a corner of the cool hall into which the door opened. It was built of stone, and the carved mouldings let into the walls, the fragments of gargoyles and sculptured images, bore testimony to the truth of its having been built out of the demolished church. In one corner was an oblong and carved wooden table littered with a painter's apparatus, and stacks of canvases leaned against the walls. He jerked his thumb towards the head of an angel that was built into the mantelpiece and giggled. "Quite a sanctified air," he said, "so we tone it down for the purposes of ordinary life by a different sort of art. Have a drink? No? Well, turn over some of my pictures while I put myself to rights." He was justified in his own estimate of his skill. He could paint, and apparently he could paint anything, but never have I seen pictures so inexplicably hellish. There were exquisite studies of trees, and you knew that something lurked in the flickering shadows. There was a drawing of his cat sunning itself in the window, even as I had just now seen it, and yet it was no cat, but some beast of awful malignity. There was a boy stretched naked on the sands, not human, but some evil thing which had come out of the sea. Above all, there were pictures of his garden overgrown and jungle-like, and you knew that in the bushes were presences ready to spring out on you. "Well, do you like my style?" he said as he came up, glass in hand. The tumbler of spirits that he held had not been diluted. "I try to paint the essence of what I see, not the mere husk and skin of it, but its nature, where it comes from, and what gave it birth. There's much in common between a cat and a fuchsia bush, if you look at them closely enough. Everything came out of the slime of the pit, and it's all going back there. I should like to do a picture of you some day. I'd hold the mirror up to nature, as that old lunatic said." After this first meeting, I saw him occasionally throughout the months of that wonderful summer. Often he kept to his house and to his painting for days together, and then, perhaps some evening, I would find him lounging on the pier, always alone, and every time we met thus, the repulsion and interest grew, for every time he seemed to have gone farther along a path of secret knowledge, towards some evil shrine where complete initiation awaited him. And then, suddenly, the end came. I had met him thus one evening on the cliffs while the October sunset still burned in the sky. But over it with amazing rapidity there spread from the west a great blackness of cloud, such as I have never seen for denseness. The light was sucked from the sky, the dusk fell in ever thicker layers. He suddenly became conscious of this. "I must get back as quick as I can," he said. "It will be dark in a few minutes, and my servant is out. The lamps will not be lit." He stepped out with extraordinary briskness for one who shambled and could scarcely lift his feet, and soon broke out into a stumbling run. In the gathering darkness I could see that his face was moist with the dew of some unspoken terror. "You must come with me," he panted, "for so we shall get the lights burning the sooner. I cannot do without light." I had to exert myself to the full to keep up with him, for terror winged him, and even so I fell behind, so that when I came to the garden gate, he was already halfway up the path to the house. I saw him enter, leaving the door wide, and found him fumbling with matches, but his hand so trembled that he could not transfer the light to the wick of the lamp. "But what's the hurry about?" I asked. Suddenly his eyes focused themselves on the open door behind me, and he jumped from his seat beside the table which had once been the altar of God, with a gasp and a scream. "No, no," he cried, "keep it off!" I turned and saw what he had seen. The thing had entered and now was swiftly sliding across the floor towards him, like some gigantic caterpillar. A stale phosphorescent light came from it, for though the dusk had grown to blackness outside, I could see it quite distinctly in the awful light of its own presence. From it, too, there came an odour of corruption and decay, as from slime that has long lain below water. It seemed to have no head, but on the front of it was an orifice of puckered skin, which opened and shut and slavered at the edges. It was hairless and slug-like in shape and in texture. As it advanced, its forepart reared itself from the ground, like a snake about to strike, and it fastened on him. At that sight, and with the yells of his agony in my ears, the panic which had struck me relaxed into a hopeless courage, and with palsied, impotent hands I tried to lay hold of the thing. But I could not. Though something material was there, it was impossible to grasp it. My hands sunk in it as in thick mud. It was like wrestling with a nightmare. I think that but a few seconds elapsed before all was over. The screams of the wretched man sank to moans and mutterings as the thing fell on him. He panted once or twice and was still. For a moment longer there came gurglings and sucking noises, and then it slid out even as it had entered. I lit the lamp which he had fumbled with, and there on the floor he lay, no more than a rind of skin in loose folds over projecting bones. The end. The Ash Tree by M.R.James. Everyone who has travelled over eastern England knows the smaller country houses with which it is studded, the rather dank little buildings, usually in the Italian style, surrounded with parks of some 80 to 100 acres. For me, they have always had a very strong attraction, with the grey paling of split oak, the noble trees, the meres with their reed beds, and the line of distant woods. Then I like the pillared portico, perhaps stuck onto a red brick Queen Anne house, which has been faced with stucco to bring it into line with the Grecian taste of the end of the 18th century. The hall inside, going up to the roof, which hall ought always to be provided with a gallery and a small organ. I like the library too, where you may find anything from a Psalter of the 13th century to a Shakespeare quarto. I like the pictures, of course, and perhaps, most of all, I like fancying what life in such a house was when it was first built, and in the piping times of landlord's prosperity, and not least now when, if money is not so plentiful, taste is more varied and life quite as interesting. I wish to have one of these houses and enough money to keep it together and entertain my friends in it modestly. But this is a digression. I have to tell you of a curious series of events which happened in such a house as I have tried to describe. It is Castringham Hall in Suffolk. I think a good deal has been done to the building since the period of my story, but the essential features I have sketched are still there. Italian portico, square block of white house, older inside than out, park with fringe of woods, and mere. The one feature that marked out the house from a score of others is gone. As you looked at it from the park, you saw on the right a great old ash tree growing within half a dozen yards of the wall, and almost or quite touching the building with its branches. I suppose it had stood there ever since Castringham ceased to be a fortified place, and since the moat was filled in and the Elizabethan dwelling house built. At any rate, it had well nigh attained its full dimensions in the year 1690. In that year, the district in which the hall is situated was the scene of a number of witch trials. It will be long, I think, before we arrive at a just estimate of the amount of solid reason, if there was any, which lay at the root of the universal fear of witches in old times. Whether the persons accused of this offence really did imagine that they were possessed of unusual powers of any kind, or whether they had the will at least, if not the power, of doing mischief to their neighbours, or whether all the confessions, of which there are so many, were extorted by the mere cruelty of the witch-finders, these are questions which are not, I fancy, yet solved. And the present narrative gives me pause. I cannot altogether sweep it away as mere invention. The reader must judge for himself. Castringham contributed a victim to the auto-da-fe. Mrs. Mothersole was her name, and she differed from the ordinary run of village witches only in being rather better off and in a more influential position. Efforts were made to save her by several reputable farmers of the parish. They did their best to testify to her character, and showed considerable anxiety as to the verdict of the jury. But what seems to have been fatal to the woman was the evidence of the then proprietor of Castringham Hall, Sir Matthew Fell. He deposed to having watched her on 3 different occasions from his window at the full of the moon, gathering sprigs from the ash tree near my house. She had climbed into the branches, clad only in her shift, and was cutting off small twigs with a peculiarly curved knife, and as she did so she seemed to be talking to herself. On each occasion Sir Matthew had done his best to capture the woman, but she had always taken alarm at some accidental noise he had made, and all he could see when he got down to the garden was a hare running across the park in the direction of the village. On the 3rd night he had been at the pains to follow at his best speed, and had gone straight to Mrs. Mothersole's house, but he had had to wait a quarter of an hour battering at her door, and then she had come out very cross and apparently very sleepy, as if just out of bed, and he had no good explanation to offer of his visit. Mainly on this evidence, though there was much more of a less striking and unusual kind from other parishioners, Mrs. Mothersole was found guilty and condemned to die. She was hanged a week after the trial, with 5 or 6 more unhappy creatures, at Bury St. Edmunds. Sir Matthew Fell, then Deputy Sheriff, was present at the execution. It was a damp, drizzly March morning when the cart made its way up the rough grass hill outside Northgate, where the gallows stood. The other victims were apathetic or broken down with misery, but Mrs. Mothersole was, as in life so in death, of a very different temper. Her poisonous rage, as a reporter of the time puts it, did so work upon the bystanders, yea, even upon the hangman, that it was constantly affirmed of all that saw her that she presented the living aspect of a mad devil. Yet she offered no resistance to the officers of the law, only she looked upon those that laid hands upon her with so direful and venomous an aspect that, as one of them afterwards assured me, the mere thought of it preyed inwardly upon his mind for 6 months after. However, all that she is reported to have said was these seemingly meaningless words, "There will be guests at the hall," which she repeated more than once in an undertone. Sir Matthew Fell was not unimpressed by the bearing of the woman. He had some talk upon the matter with the vicar of his parish, with whom he travelled home after the assize business was over. His evidence at the trial had not been very willingly given. He was not specially infected with the witch-finding mania, but he declared, then and afterwards, that he could not give any other account of the matter than that he had given, and that he could not possibly have been mistaken as to what he saw. The whole transaction had been repugnant to him, for he was a man who liked to be on pleasant terms with those about him. But he saw a duty to be done in this business, and he had done it. That seems to have been the gist of his sentiments, and the vicar applauded it, as any reasonable man must have done. A few weeks after, when the moon of May was at the full, vicar and squire met again in the park and walked to the hall together. Lady Fell was with her mother, who was dangerously ill, and Sir Matthew was alone at home. So the vicar, Mr. Crome, was easily persuaded to take a late supper at the hall. Sir Matthew was not very good company this evening. The talk ran chiefly on family and parish matters, and as luck would have it, Sir Matthew made a memorandum in writing of certain wishes or intentions of his regarding his estates, which afterwards proved exceedingly useful. When Mr. Crome thought of starting for home about 9:30, Sir Matthew and he took a preliminary turn on the gravelled walk at the back of the house. The only incident that struck Mr. Crome was this. They were in sight of the ash tree which I described as growing near the windows of the building, when Sir Matthew stopped and said, "What is that runs up and down the stem of the ash? It is never a squirrel. They will all be in their nests by now." The vicar looked and saw the moving creature, but he could make nothing of its colour in the moonlight. The sharp outline, however, seen for an instant, was imprinted on his brain, and he could have sworn, he said, though it sounded foolish, that, squirrel or not, it had more than 4 legs. Still, not much was to be made of the momentary vision, and the 2 men parted. They may have met since then, but it was not for a score of years. Next day, Sir Matthew Fell was not downstairs at 6 in the morning, as was his custom, nor at 7, nor yet at 8. Hereupon the servants went and knocked at his chamber door. I need not prolong the description of their anxious listenings and renewed batterings on the panels. The door was opened at last from the outside, and they found their master dead and black. So much you have guessed. That there were any marks of violence did not at the moment appear, but the window was open. One of the men went to fetch the parson, and then by his directions rode on to give notice to the coroner. Mr. Crome himself went as quick as he might to the hall, and was shown to the room where the dead man lay. He has left some notes among his papers which show how genuine a respect and sorrow was felt for Sir Matthew, and there is also this passage, which I transcribe for the sake of the light it throws upon the course of events, and also upon the common beliefs of the time. There was not the least trace of an entrance having been forced to the chamber, but the casement stood open, as my poor friend would always have it in this season. He had his evening drink of small ale in a silver vessel of about a pint measure, and tonight had not drunk it out. This drink was examined by the physician from Bury, a Mr. Hodgkins, who could not, however, as he afterwards declared upon his oath, before the coroner's quest discover that any matter of a venomous kind was present in it. For, as was natural, in the great swelling and blackness of the corpse, there was talk made among the neighbours of poison. The body was very much disordered as it laid in the bed, being twisted after so extreme a sort as gave too probable conjecture that my worthy friend and patron had expired in great pain and agony. And what is as yet unexplained, and to myself the argument of some horrid and artful design in the perpetrators of this barbarous murder, was this, that the women which were entrusted with the laying out of the corpse and washing it, being both sad persons and very well respected in their mournful profession, came to me in a great pain and distress both of mind and body, saying, what was indeed confirmed upon the first view, that they had no sooner touched the breast of the corpse with their naked hands than they were sensible of a more than ordinary violent smart and aching in their palms, which, with their whole forearms, in no long time, swelled so immoderately, the pain still continuing that, as afterwards proved, during many weeks they were forced to lay by the exercise of their calling, and yet no marks seen on the skin. Upon hearing this, I sent for the physician, who was still in the house, and we made as careful a proof as we were able by the help of a small magnifying lens of crystal of the condition of the skin on this part of the body, but could not detect with the instrument we had any matter of importance beyond a couple of small punctures or pricks, which we then concluded were the spots by which the poison might be introduced, remembering that ring of Pope Borgia, with other known specimens of the horrid art of the Italian poisoners of the last age. So much is to be said of the symptoms seen on the corpse. As to what I am to add, it is merely my own experiment, and to be left to posterity to judge whether there be anything of value therein. There was on the table by the bedside a Bible of the small size, in which my friend, punctual as in matters of less moment, so in this more weighty one, used nightly, and upon his first rising to read a set portion, and I taking it up, not without a tear duly paid to him, which from the study of this poorer adumbration was now passed to the contemplation of its great original, it came into my thoughts, as at such moments of helplessness we are prone to catch at any the least glimmer that makes promise of light, to make trial of that old and by many accounted superstitious practice of drawing the sorts, of which a principal instance, in the case of his late sacred majesty the blessed martyr King Charles and my Lord Falkland, was now much talked of. I must needs admit that by my trial not much assistance was afforded me, Yet as the cause and origin of these dreadful events may hereafter be searched out, I set down the results. In the case it may be found that they pointed the true quarter of the mischief to a quicker intelligence than my own. I made then 3 trials, opening the book and placing my finger upon certain words, which gave in the first these words from Luke 13:7, cut it down. In the second, Isaiah 13:20, it shall never be inhabited. And upon the third experiment, Job 39:30, her young ones also suck up blood. This is all that need be quoted from Mr. Crome's papers. Sir Matthew Fell was duly coffined and laid into the earth, and his funeral sermon, preached by Mr. Crome on the following Sunday, has been printed under the title of The Unsearchable Way, or England's Danger and the Malicious Dealings of Antichrist. It being the vicar's view, as well as that most commonly held in the neighbourhood, that the squire was the victim of a recrudescence of the popish plot. His son, Sir Matthew II, succeeded to the title and estates, and so ends the first act of the Castringham tragedy. It is to be mentioned, though the fact is not surprising, that the new baronet did not occupy the room in which his father had died. Nor indeed was it slept in by anyone but an occasional visitor during the whole of his occupation. He died in 1735, and I do not find that anything particular marked his reign, save a curiously constant mortality among his cattle and livestock in general, which showed a tendency to increase slightly as time went on. Those who are interested in the details will find a statistical account in a letter to the Gentleman's Magazine of 1772, which draws the facts from the baronet's own papers. He put an end to it at last by a very simple expedient, that of shutting up all his beasts in sheds at night, and keeping no sheep in his park. For he had noticed that nothing was ever attacked that spent the night indoors. After that, the disorder confined itself to wild birds and beasts of chase. But as we have no good account of the symptoms, and as all-night watching was quite unproductive of any clue, I do not dwell on what the Suffolk farmers called the Castringham sickness. The second Sir Matthew died in 1735, as I said, and was duly succeeded by his son, Sir Richard. It was in his time that the great family pew was built out on the north side of the parish church. So large were the squire's ideas that several of the graves on that unhallowed side of the building had to be disturbed to satisfy his requirements. Among them was that of Mrs. Mothersole, the position of which was accurately known, thanks to a note on a plan of the church and yard, both made by Mr. Crome. A certain amount of interest was excited in the village when it was known that the famous witch, who was still remembered by a few, was to be exhumed. And the feeling of surprise, and indeed disquiet, was very strong when it was found that though her coffin was fairly sound and unbroken, there was no trace whatever inside it of body, bones, or dust. Indeed, it is a curious phenomenon, for at the time of her burying no such things were dreamt of as resurrection men, and it is difficult to conceive any rational motive for stealing a body otherwise than for the uses of the dissecting room. The incident revived for a time all the stories of witch trials and of the exploits of the witches, dormant for 40 years, and Sir Richard's orders that the coffin should be burnt were thought by a good many to be rather foolhardy, though they were duly carried out. Sir Richard was a pestilent innovator, it is certain. Before his time the hall had been a fine block of the mellowest red brick, but Sir Richard had travelled in Italy and become infected with the Italian taste, and having more money than his predecessors, he determined to leave an Italian palace where he had found an English house. So stucco and ashlar masked the brick. Some indifferent Roman marbles were planted about in the entrance hall and gardens. A reproduction of the Sibyl's Temple at Tivoli was erected on the opposite bank of the mere, and Castringham took on an entirely new, and I must say, a less engaging aspect. But it was much admired and served as a model to a good many of the neighbouring gentry in after years. One morning, it was in 1754, Sir Richard woke after a night of discomfort. It had been windy, and his chimney had smoked persistently, and yet it was so cold that he must keep up a fire. Also, something had so rattled about the window that no man could get a moment's peace. Further, there was the prospect of several guests of position arriving in the course of the day, who would expect sport of some kind, and the inroads of the distemper, which continued among his game, had been lately so serious that he was afraid for his reputation as a game preserver. But what really touched him most nearly was the other matter of his sleepless night. He could certainly not sleep in that room again. That was the chief subject of his meditations at breakfast, and after it he began a systematic examination of the rooms to see which would suit his notions best. It was long before he found one. This had a window with an eastern aspect, and that with a northern. This door the servants would be always passing, and he did not like the bedstead in that. No, he must have a room with a western lookout, so that the sun could not wake him early, and it must be out of the way of the business of the house. The housekeeper was at the end of her resources. "Well, Sir Richard," she said, "you know that there is but one room like that in the house." "Which may that be?" said Sir Richard. "And that is Sir Matthew's, the west chamber." "Well, put me in there, for there I'll lie tonight," said her master. "Which way is it? Here, to be sure." And he hurried off. "Oh, Sir Richard, but no one has slept there these 40 years. The air has hardly been changed since Sir Matthew died there." Thus she spoke and rustled after him. "Come, open the door, Mrs. Chiddock. I'll see the chamber at least." So it was opened, and indeed the smell was very close and earthy. Sir Richard crossed to the window, and impatiently, as was his wont, threw the shutters back and flung open the casement. For this end of the house was one which the alterations had barely touched, grown up as it was with the great ash tree, and being otherwise concealed from view. "Air it, Mrs. Chiddock, all to-day, and move my bed furniture in the afternoon. Put the Bishop of Kilmore in my old room." "Pray, Sir Richard," said a new voice, breaking in on this speech, "might I have the favour of a moment's interview?" Sir Richard turned round and saw a man in black in the doorway, who bowed. "I must ask your indulgence for this intrusion, Sir Richard. You will, perhaps, hardly remember me. My name is William Crome, and my grandfather was vicar here in your grandfather's time." "Well, sir," said Sir Richard, "the name of Crome is always a passport to Castringham. I am glad to renew a friendship of 2 generations' standing. In what can I serve you for your hour of calling? And if I do not mistake you, your bearing shows you to be in some haste." "That is no more than the truth, sir. I am riding from Norwich to Bury St. Edmunds with what haste I can make, and I have called in on my way to leave with you some papers which we have but just come upon in looking over what my grandfather left at his death. It is thought you may find some matters of family interest in them." "You are mighty obliging, Mr. Crome, and if you will be so good as to follow me to the parlour and drink a glass of wine, we will take a first look at these same papers together. And you, Mrs. Chiddock, as I said, be about airing this chamber. Yes, it is here my grandfather died. Yes, the tree perhaps does make the place a little dampish. No, I do not wish to listen to any more. Make no difficulties, I beg. You have your orders. Go. Will you follow me, sir?" They went to the study, the packet which young Mr. Crome had brought. He was then just become a Fellow of Clare Hall in Cambridge, I may say, and subsequently brought out a respectable edition of Polyaenus, contained among other things the notes which the old vicar had made upon the occasion of Sir Matthew Fell's death. And for the first time Sir Richard was confronted with the enigmatical sorts biblicae which you have heard. They amused him a good deal. "Well," he said, "my grandfather's Bible gave one prudent piece of advice. Cut it down. If that stands for the ash tree, he may rest assured I shall not neglect it. Such a nest of catarrhs and agues was never seen." The parlour contained the family books which, pending the arrival of a collection which Sir Richard had made in Italy, and the building of a proper room to receive them, were not many in number. Sir Richard looked up from the paper to the bookcase. "I wonder," says he, "whether the old prophet is there yet. I fancy I see him." Crossing the room, he took out a dumpy Bible, which, sure enough, bore on the flyleaf the inscription, "To Matthew Fell, from his loving godmother Anne Aldous, 2nd September 1659. "It would be no bad plan to test him again, Mr. Crome. I will wager we get a couple of names in the Chronicles. What have we here? 'Thou shalt seek me in the morning, and I shall not be.' Well, well, your grandfather would have made a fine omen of that, eh? No more prophets for me. They are all in a tale. And now, Mr. Crome, I am infinitely obliged to you for your packet. You will, I fear, be impatient to get on. Pray allow me another glass." So with offers of hospitality which were genuinely meant, for Sir Richard thought well of the young man's address and manner, they parted. In the afternoon came the guests, the Bishop of Kilmore, Lady Mary Harvey, Sir William Kentfield, etc. Dinner at 5, wine, cards, supper, and dispersal to bed. Next morning Sir Richard is disinclined to take his gun with the rest. He talks with the Bishop of Kilmore. This prelate, unlike a good many of the Irish bishops of his day, had visited his see, and indeed resided there for some considerable time. This morning, as the two were walking along the terrace and talking over the alterations and improvements in the house, the bishop said, pointing to the window of the west room, "You could never get one of my Irish flock to occupy that room, Sir Richard." "Why is that, my lord?" "It is in fact my own." "Well, our Irish peasantry will always have it that it brings the worst of luck to sleep near an ash tree, and you have a fine growth of ash not 2 yards from your chamber window. Perhaps," the bishop went on with a smile, "it has given you a touch of its quality already, for you do not seem, if I may say it, so much the fresher for your night's rest as your friends would like to see you." "That, or something else, it is true, cost me my sleep from 12 to 4, my lord. But the tree is to come down tomorrow, so I shall not hear much more from it." "I applaud your determination. It can hardly be wholesome to have the air you breathe strained, as it were, through all that leafage. Your lordship is right there, I think. But I had not my window open last night. It was rather the noise that went on, no doubt from the twigs sweeping the glass, that kept me open-eyed." "I think that can hardly be, Sir Richard. Here, you see it from this point. None of these nearest branches even can touch your casement unless there were a gale, and there was none of that last night. They missed the panes by a foot." "No, sir, true. What then will it be, I wonder, that scratched and rustled so aye and covered the dust on my sill with lines and marks?" At last they agreed that the rats must have come up through the ivy. That was the bishop's idea, and Sir Richard jumped at it. So the day passed quietly, and night came, and the party dispersed to their rooms and wished Sir Richard a better night. And now we are in his bedroom, with the light out and the squire in bed. The room is over the kitchen, and the night outside still and warm, so the window stands open. There is very little light about the bedstead, but there is a strange movement there. It seems as if Sir Richard were moving his head rapidly to and fro with only the slightest possible sound. And now you would guess, so deceptive is the half-darkness, that he had several heads, round and brownish, which moved back and forward even as low as his chest. It is a horrible illusion. Is it nothing more? There, something drops off the bed with a soft plump like a kitten, and is out of the window in a flash. Another, 4, and after that there is quiet again. "Thou shalt seek me in the morning, and I shall not be." As with Sir Matthew, so with Sir Richard, dead and black in his bed. A pale and silent party of guests and servants gathered under the window when the news was known. Italian poisoners, popish emissaries, infected air. All these and more guesses were hazarded, and the Bishop of Kilmore looked at the tree in the fork of whose lower boughs a white tomcat was crouching, looking down the hollow which the years had gnawed in the trunk. It was watching something inside the tree with great interest. Suddenly it got up and craned over the hole. Then a bit of the edge on which it stood gave way, and it went slithering in. Everyone looked up at the noise of the fall. It is known to most of us that a cat can cry, but few of us have heard, I hope, such a yell as came out of the trunk of the great ash. 2 or 3 screams there were, the witnesses are not sure which, and then a slight and muffled noise of some commotion or struggling was all that came. But Lady Mary Harvey fainted outright, and the housekeeper stopped her ears and fled till she fell on the terrace. The Bishop of Kilmore and Sir William Kentfield stayed, yet even they were daunted, though it was only at the cry of a cat, and Sir William swallowed once or twice before he could say, "There is something more than we know of in that tree, my lord. I am for an instant search." And this was agreed upon. A ladder was brought, and one of the gardeners went up, and looking down the hollow could detect nothing but a few dim indications of something moving. They got a lantern and let it down by a rope. "We must get at the bottom of this, my life upon it, my lord. But the secret of these terrible deaths is there." Up went the gardener again with the lantern and let it down the hole cautiously. They saw the yellow light upon his face as he bent over, and saw his face struck with an incredulous terror and loathing before he cried out in a dreadful voice and fell back from the ladder, where happily he was caught by 2 of the men, letting the lantern fall inside the tree. He was in a dead faint, and it was some time before any word could be got from him. By then they had something else to look at. The lantern must have broken at the bottom, and the light in it caught upon dry leaves and rubbish that lay there, for in a few minutes a dense smoke began to come up, and then flame. And to be short, the tree was in a blaze. The bystanders made a ring at some yards' distance, and Sir William and the Bishop sent men to get what weapons and tools they could, for clearly whatever might be using the tree as its lair would be forced out by the fire. So it was. First at the fork they saw a round body covered with fire, the size of a man's head, appear very suddenly, then seem to collapse and fall back. This 5 or 6 times, then a similar ball leapt into the air and fell on the grass, where after a moment it lay still. The bishop went as near as he dared to it and saw what but the remains of an enormous spider, veinous and seared. And as the fire burned lower down, more terrible bodies like this began to break out from the trunk, and it was seen that these were covered with greyish hair. All that day the ash burned, and until it fell to pieces the men stood about it, and from time to time killed the brutes as they darted out. At last there was a long interval when none appeared, and they cautiously closed in and examined the roots of the tree. They found, says the Bishop of Kilmore, below it a rounded hollow place in the earth, wherein were 2 or 3 bodies of these creatures that had plainly been smothered by the smoke, and what is to me more curious, at the side of this den, against the wall, was crouching the anatomy or skeleton of a human being, with the skin dried upon the bones, having some remains of black hair, which was pronounced by those that examined it to be undoubtedly the body of a woman, and clearly dead for a period of 50 years. The end.